when Star Wars came out, everybody said, oh, it's a silly movie, it's just a bunch of space battles and stuff. It's not real. There's nothing behind it. And I said, well, there is stuff behind it. It's not just a space battle. There's more to it than that. It's much, much more complicated than that. But nobody would listen. So they just said, oh, well, it's simple, and we like the spaceships, we like the stuff.
Qu'est-ce qu'on va voir?
Je ne sais pas, des trucs lumière les sons.
Over the last few years, I have started to see a bit of a critical reevaluation of the Star Wars prequels happening. And I think that people have always sort of had an idea that there could have been deeper meanings intended in the films. I think that people have always had an idea that the Star Wars films reference other films, and that there were repeated moments going on in the movies and some parallel story points.
I love you.
I know. I love you.
I know.
Recently, though, I have seen people starting to show a little bit of a willingness to say that maybe there was more going on in the movies than they were originally given credit for.
That's good. You've taken your first step into a larger world.
The thing is, though, while people are noticing a few visual things that Lucas is doing, there are actually a lot more. Like a lot more. Like, no matter how many you've found, if you keep digging, you'll just keep finding new ones. Actually, there are even way more than I thought there were when I set out to make this video essay. Hundreds and hundreds more. Once I started going through scenes shot by shot to compare them for this video, I started to find so much more stuff than most people ever see in these movies, including myself. And, you know, I've been obsessed with this stuff for 20 years. So one of the things I want to do in this video is try to give an idea of the scope of the visual things that Lucas is doing and include as many references as I can. But as I work on this, I've already had somebody say to me, you know, well, so what if there are a lot of references? That still doesn't address the problems that people have with the movies. But the thing is that finding these visual things that are going on is just the start. Understanding how and why Lucas is doing them and what they all mean is the actually interesting question. And I think that that too is much more complicated and ambitious than most people realize. It seems like an obvious thing to say, but to really try to understand a piece of art, you have to ask what the creator was trying to do. With movies like Star Wars, very few people actually do that. They approach it from the point of view of what they want from the movies. You know, now that every single series is an endless franchise, people are used to entertainment that has long since grown past what the original creator intended, and it's now produced by corporations whose goal is to do whatever will please the largest number of fans possible. You know, so who cares what this George Lucas person has to say about Star Wars, right? People don't understand that the whole reason these things exist in the first place is that they were expressions of something personal to the individuals that made them.
Does your personal life influence your writing?
Well, there's no way to write without writing from yourself. I mean, you know, stuff gets made out of things that you care about, whether you've actually lived them or not. There are emotional issues that you deal with. And I think that's always a major factor with any writer. It's hard to write without having some kind of emotional connection to the material. I've never seen any reason not to. It's easy to write that way. It's hard to write in the abstract. So when I write a scene that moves me or I care about or is something that is personal to me.
Now the intention of the corporations behind these things is to remove the actual artist from the process of making art as quickly as possible. If somebody is involved who is trying to make the movies for themselves rather than millions of hypothetical fans, that audience of one has a lot less potential profit. People forget that the only reason Lucas was able to create these movies at all was that he managed to maintain control. Studios are reactive, not creative, and they fought him every step of the way. I think Star Wars occupies a unique place in popular culture because it's the only time a project remotely at that scale could be said to have one author.
The auteur theory of film actually is very true if you know directors, because they are very much like their movies. And in the case of somebody who writes and directs, you know, it is my life. I mean, everything I write is my life. I'm not writing some sort of hypothetical thesis on something. I'm writing a story that I have to get extremely emotionally involved in because it's going to take 2 or 3 years of my life to do it. So I can't just sort of say, oh, this will be fun and knock it off in a week. This is like a marriage. This goes on. You have to be in love with this thing for at least 4 or 5 years and probably for the rest of your life.
I think the problem that a lot of fans ran into is that the series Lucas made lasted so long that they had grown up with Star Wars and they thought they knew it intimately, but then this pesky author guy was still around making it to his tastes and not to theirs. When they watched the original trilogy, they had 20 years to fill in the gaps and backstories with their own imaginations, and then when they saw what Lucas was picturing, it turned out that they hadn't been mind readers. He had a different view of some things than they did. There's a fundamental difference between Lucas creating a franchise he started how he wants and a corporation making a Spider-Man or Batman movie distilling decades of comics by hundreds of artists.
There are some people here that have your Princess Leia hairstyle up there.
Oh, that's disturbing.
The fans approach the two the same, though. They think that the job of filmmakers is to give them the movie that they want to get.
Thumbs way down.
You didn't like it?
No, I think I deserve a public apology from George Lucas.
For me, though, that's the entire reason Lucas's 6 Star Wars movies are vastly more interesting than the lifeless simulacra that Marvel Studios pukes up onto the screen. When I went to see the Star Wars prequels, it's because I wanted to see what George Lucas would do. If I wanted to see fan fiction, I would have written it myself. Lucas didn't make the prequels that I would have made, and why is that a problem? When you judge a piece of art, the criteria you're supposed to use is how closely the artist achieved their goals. If you don't like musicals, that's fine, but that doesn't mean that all musicals are bad movies. They could be a very well done example of something that you don't personally enjoy. There's a fine line there, which I think a lot of people struggle to understand, which is the difference between talking about the piece of art and talking about yourself and your own tastes and emotions. People compare Star Wars prequels to other blockbusters of a similar size, and when it doesn't serve the same purposes, they think they found a flaw. And, you know, what they're really doing is looking at an apple and complaining that it isn't an orange.
I had no idea what that movie was about.
People who don't like the prequels, you know, they strut about like their opinions are this unanimously agreed upon consensus. So it's really strange that I don't think I've ever seen a single negative review of the Star Wars prequels that talks about the movies that George Lucas actually made, as opposed to talking about the movies that the reviewer was wishing he had made. If you really want to understand the movies, then the people only thinking about it in terms of what they want to see aren't asking the most important question.
Hello, George Lucas. Why did you create Star Wars?
You know, I ask myself that every day. Why?
Let's go all the way back to the beginning. What was the beginning?
I would say probably the original impetus for the whole thing was, I used to watch a serial on television called Adventure Theater, and they had Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe on it, and I used to love that.
The idea that Star Wars is a Joseph Campbell-inspired fairy tale dressed up in the Flash Gordon aesthetic is true, but it's a superficial jumping-off point. Lucas used to say that a lot to explain how other work influences what he's doing, but in recent years he's been trying to emphasize other things that were more important.
Having discussed this with you before, I know that one thing that did catch your eye and attention were the old serials, the Saturday matinee serials that they showed on TV in those days.
Right. But those were, you know, there was a ton of things.
Yeah, but if it hadn't been for seeing Flash Gordon and the Perils of Nyoka and serials like that, there might, I mean, there is a through line from them to Star Wars and to certainly to Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, but that was quite a ways into my career. Francis found out about it, and he said, I heard you were going to transfer to the animation department. What's that all about? And I said, well, I think you're boring. I said, I've done this. I don't want to do Hollywood movies. I have no interest in this at all. You know, I'm really going to go off and be a documentary cameraman. I'm going to do more experimental type of films. I do not like character-driven drama. I don't like plots. I'm not into this stuff. You know, cinema is pure. You know, it's not photographing a stage play. It's not photographing a book. It's pure. It's his own medium. So he liked that. My experiences in San Francisco, where there was a very large experimental film community called Canyon Cinema and Environs, and that's what I liked. I liked pure cinema, and when I went to school, that's what I was going to do. I said, I don't want to tell stories, I don't like to write scripts, I don't like characters, I don't like any of this stuff. But
the term pure cinema was coined by Henri Chaumetre in the 1920s, and all it refers to are ways of communication unique to film that are created by the editing and juxtaposition of sequential images in time.
I was obsessed with experimental films, most of the kind I'd seen in San Francisco with Bruce Conner and Bruce Bailey and George Cukor and all, you know, Kuchar and all those guys.
In 1961, a group of artists and sort of underground filmmakers just got together and started screening films in their backyard in the East Bay and called that Canyon Cinema. They kind of identified themselves as the underground cinema or independent cinema, avant-garde cinema, of a kind of fiercely independent movement of filmmakers outside of the Hollywood mainstream.
Between his film classes and venues like Canyon Cinema, Lucas spent his formative years mainlining experimental films like Bruce Bailey and Will Hendel's impressionistic montages, abstract light and color effects by people like Jordan Belson, Stan Brakhage, Bruce Conner's kinetic juxtapositions of film and music. Norman McLaren's experiments combining live action and animation. And also importantly, cinema verite documentaries by people like Claude Jutra. If you watch something like Bruce Conner's short Vivian, you can see Lucas's earliest student films clearly aspiring to emulate a similar use of music and frenetic editing.
Francis and I moved to San Francisco because neither one of us liked the Hollywood environment. We started a company up here, and I got to take one of my student films and turn it into a feature, which was
THX.
But it was a tone poem. It was just a visual storytelling. You know, the characters and the plot were not as important as the metaphor and the symbolism, and as a result, and the emotional connection between the moving image and the audience.
Je retourne à la maison avec eux autres.
Écoute, l'année prochaine, je t'envoie au collège. Okay?
But it's a whole nother year. Look, it's only one more season.
Come on, what are you talking about?
Well, I was thinking I could wait a year, you know, go to city for a while.
You chicken thing.
Oh, wait a minute. After all we went through to get accepted, we're finally getting out of this turkey town, and now you want to crawl back into your cell, right?
Please come back. You have nothing to be afraid of.
I haven't changed much over the years. It's funny, if you were to see all the films, you begin to see that there's a certain continuity of eccentric taste that flies through those movies.
People think of THX as being more experimental, but you can also find these influences all over Star Wars, from name-checking specific shorts, to things like the jump to hyperspace, which I think is at least partly inspired by Jordan Belson's light shows.
I was trying to make the film look like a documentary film. We used to call it the documentary film of the future. And the idea was that it looked very gritty, it looked very real, it looked like it was taking place in a real future.
Lucas was heavily influenced by the camera work in documentaries that were being made at the time, like the Canadian short 60 Cycles. He was also more than a little influenced by the use of music in these films, and he tips his hat directly in American Graffiti to let you know what he's been watching. Actually, he shot THX, American Graffiti, and Star Wars all in a style inspired by documentaries like Jutra's. Lucas's Star Wars episodes have a fairly strict style book, and the ideals of these types of observational documentaries are one of the main elements.
The way these films are put together, they're shot very much like a documentary film, and the action is staged, and then I shoot around it. I don't stage for the camera. And as a result, there are a lot of things that happen pretty much by accident. It lends an aura of authenticity to everything, where things float off the shot. I don't really put people in the center, and I let them sort of drift around in the frame a little bit more than you normally do in a movie. This is especially true in this scene here, as she goes up the ramp, where Jar Jar goes almost completely off the camera, and then as Anakin and R2 approach, well, Jar Jar's an animated character. I can put him wherever I want. But I purposely put him way off the side of the screen there. You know, it just gives you the sense that it wasn't, just staged perfectly for the camera, that things are kind of caught. They aren't perfect. It actually happened, that Jar Jar was actually there. and I actually had to frame him.
He avoids things like push-ins on the actors because that indicates the presence of a storyteller who is telling you that the moment is important. There aren't camera moves that were planned as though they knew what action was about to take place. The camera is not omniscient. These rules were broken in Empire very slightly because Irvin Kershner was given more creative control than any other director throughout the 6 Star Wars movies Lucas made. But even Kershner only did it sparingly, and mainly because his whole contribution to that film was to put a focus on the actors.
This is the kind of scene that I like to do with the people. I like to fill up the frame with the faces. There's nothing more interesting than the landscape of the human face.
Lucas avoids things like subjective point of view shots, and not because he doesn't think it's important to let you know what the characters are thinking, but because it involves a layer of artifice that tells you aren't watching a real event. In a point of view shot, the camera is in the location where the character would be standing if it was a real situation, and it indicates that the scene is a scripted event rather than a real one that was captured. You can see where a shot like this one in Empire is a little bit of a problem, because it does indicate that the action was staged for the camera. I think Lucas probably would have been more likely to do this as 2 shots, one establishing the hangar bay, and then another on Leia's speech. It might seem more stylish to have it in one shot with a graceful move, but if this was a real event, filming it like this would involve Leia timing her speech to match her camera move.
It's the kind of bad camera work that I like the most of all. That's the thing that tells you that it's real, only you obviously know it's not real, so it's like it confuses you in a way that's very satisfying.
Even when Lucas does put in unusual camera moves, he usually sticks to things that would be within the wheelhouse of documentary filmmakers. Because his rules are so clearly followed, when he bends them, you notice it and you can assume there's an intentional meaning.
This shot where we come right up into the ship is a concept shot, homage to Steve Spielberg, because he loves shots like this. I don't usually do them.
Once he's established the language of his films, he can say things to you by playing with it.
Having sort of level 1 of the sword fight with Obi-Wan, I then needed to progress to level 2 with Anakin, because each time we have a sword fight, it's got to get more intense and more intense. And so I came up with this idea of having Obi-Wan throw Anakin his sword so that he could fight with 2 swords for a little bit. And then I had Anakin cut a cable so I could do it in the dark. And I wanted to do a kind of a, just again, go back to my old roots of a visual sequence, just a kind of a tone poem of lightsabers moving through dark and making it more of a visual idea than a action fighting idea.
Throughout Star Wars, you can see scenes like this where Lucas is using montage to express things in an abstract way. Through this portion of the duel between Dooku and Anakin in Attack of the Clones, you'll notice that you barely ever even see their lightsabers touch. The impression of a duel is created through lights and faces and editing. Part of Lucas's education was in animation classes, and many of the filmmakers he liked were interested in including illustrative elements in their films. With things like his manipulation of images by rear projection rephotography and tinting, Will Hindell's films were described as being closer to paintings than movies. Norman McLaren combined animation techniques with live action, treating actors almost like illustration elements within his composition. He and Brakhage both sometimes painted directly onto film. You can draw a direct line from these experiments to Lucas's later philosophy about special effects. What Lucas captures in the camera is intended only to be one element of a final collage that will include material from many sources.
Well, you do it day by day, moment by moment, layer by layer. It's like watching a painter. You just, you put colors, it's not done until it's done. Until you put the final stroke on it.
Of course, the most famous short to influence Lucas is Arthur Lipsett's 2187.
Here it is, 2187.
Everything will be all right.
Lucas has even said that the term the Force was at least partly an echo of 2187.
Many people feel that in sort of the contemplation of nature and in communication with other living things, they become aware of some kind of force or something behind this apparent mask, which we see in front of us. And they call it God, or they, depending on their particular disposition.
Throughout 2187, there's an ambiguity to the connections between the images and the sounds, which are put together in unexpected ways. This creates a range of meanings and emotions from humorous to disturbing that can't be exactly articulated verbally, or just with sound, or just with pictures, or with any medium other than cinema.
And at the same time, I've been fascinated with the medium, and I've been fascinated with the the true nature of the medium, which is very different. It's been used more as a recording medium than as a art form unto itself. And that's where the kind of movies that I made that are sort of, they call them tone poems. But in the beginning, like in Russia, this was a whole movement of how do you tell visual stories basically without dialogue, without all the things that you use to tell a story, and you just use the film itself. It's kind of esoteric. I'm going to try to take it, it hasn't come much further in 100 years. I'm going to try to take it into something that is more emotionally powerful than most of the stuff we've done up to this point. I'm a big fan of silent movies. I have been since I was in school. And so in my mind, I was making a kind of abstract visual film, very much like my first film, THX, very much like my second film, American Graffiti. They're more visually oriented, and they're silent films with a soundtrack, with music, basically. I'm very keen on the soundtrack. I feel it's part of the movie, but I see the soundtrack as basically an accompanying score, even if it's sound effects or dialogue or whatever. It's just part of the accompanying score or the chorus or whatever. So when I did Star Wars, I was still in that mode. I still wanted to do it that way. I wanted to make it be kind of a silent film.
When Lucas says that Star Wars is an Eisensteinian film, he's referring to Sergei Eisenstein, a Russian filmmaker most famous for the silent film Battleship Potemkin. Eisenstein was also a teacher and a film theorist, and his greatest influence on film was probably his theory of montage, which categorized the different ways, unique from other art forms, in which cinema could elicit meaning and emotion through editing and the juxtaposition of different images. I can't really decide whether it's more pretentious to think people need me to explain these things, or to assume everybody understands them and they shouldn't have to be explained. But they're important to understanding Star Wars, and I don't see a lot of overlap between Eisenstein fans and Star Wars fans.
Yes! The Force. Yes! Yo!
So I'm going to briefly explain these ideas. The most famous example is known as the Kuleshov effect, named for a contemporary of Eisenstein who did an experiment where they took an image of a man with a neutral expression and then cut in other images to follow it. When the subsequent image was a bowl of soup, people asked what the man was feeling, replied hunger. When instead of soup, the same footage of the man was intercut with a shot of a dead child, people said that it was an image of a man feeling grief. When the man was intercut with the Zack Snyder movie, viewers said that he was feeling an intense desire to go to the box office and demand his money back.
Save Martha!
Now the third way is what one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film.
The abstract emotions of hunger and grief aren't communicated either by the man's face or by the bowl of soup, but rather by the sequential combination of the two. A lot of movies these days are basically filmed plays, which ignore the unique ways that film can create intellectual, emotional, and poetic meanings that these individual shots wouldn't have on their own. But 2187 had a much deeper influence on Lucas than just editing styles. One of its fundamental conceits is that it's made almost entirely from discarded footage from other films that was assembled into the short. As 2187 is created from found footage, the authorial intent of the film exists entirely in the way the images are combined, not in the individual images themselves. This idea of combining existing things in new ways is foundational to Lucas's concept of how he would communicate visually with Star Wars. Star Wars does have those obvious inspirations like Flash Gordon, Joseph Campbell, and many other sources that you can see, from the novel Dune,
Spice Milan,
Arrakis, Dune, Desert Planet, to the comics Valerian and Laureline. But these general influences are really just the tip of the iceberg. Star Wars also has dozens, if not hundreds, of specific images and moments directly from other films.
Some shots in here that are homages to like Ray Harryhausen and other, classic fantasy, adventure, sci-fi, horror movies. You just have to keep your eyes open and know your movie history.
If you do not speak English, I am at your disposal with 187 other languages along with their various dialects and subtongues.
I am fluent in over 6 billion forms of communication and can readily... Splendid.
This melting door scene is a direct homage to Forbidden Planet. We looked at the melting Krell door in Forbidden Planet as inspiration.
I mean, there's an obvious influence there from 2001, which is the Stargate sequence, which is things streaming by camera.
The establishing shot of Polis Massa is actually an homage to 2001.
These characters, the comedians, I wanted to do a little tip of the hat to Steven in Close Encounters.
Bombard General.
General?
In the sequence with Jar Jar, I wanted to have this comedy element going in the middle of the battle. The comedy of Buster Keaton was an inspiration for some of this, especially the sequence here where he hides under the trailer full of energy balls and then pulls them down and they chase him down the hillside. There was a sequence with this in a Buster Keaton movie with barrels where he was chased down a hill with barrels. And then we added the idea that they would, when they hit the tanks, they would blow up the tanks, and then it would sort of turn the tide of the battle.
It's George's homage to every film that he ever loved. George loves films, and that's what this film is about, is movies. Every scene is, in some way, reminiscent of a scene in a film that we all loved before, like in High Noon, there's a bar sequence, only this time it's with monsters instead of Gary Cooper. You've got The Wizard of Oz, we have a robot that looks sort of like the Tin Man. You have adventure like Robin Hood, we do swing across it. I guess it could even be like Tarzan. Buck Rogers, it's got everything in it, every ingredient. George made a movie that he wanted to see.
It's sort of a combination comic book, fairy tale, Wizard of Oz.
This sequence has a little bit of a Japanese influence with the Gungans and their feathers on the back of their canoes.
And for George, it was also an homage to Seven Samurai, the shot specifically. George had asked us to do that head rub.
The lead samurai in that picture has to shave his head to pretend that he's a monk, and he's constantly sort of rubbing his newly shaved head, and that's where that little affectation for Yoda came from. My introduction to Kurosawa's films were very powerful because it happened in film school, and I knew very little about Japanese history at that point. And when I would get thrown into something like Seven Samurai or Jimbo or Ikuro or any of the movies, it was like I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I could follow the human story, but the culture was completely complex and oblique. And I liked that. I liked that feeling of being thrown into an environment, trying to get my bearings and still be able to tell a story in that environment that made sense, that you weren't so confused that you just couldn't follow it.
The script took many, many forms, and originally we were looking for a straightforward kind of adventure scenario, loosely based on some of Kurosawa's approach, like The Hidden Fortress, which was we actually tried to buy the rights to at one time. We also tried to buy the rights to Flash Gordon as a comic strip. The script shifted and up and back in terms of complications, in terms of characters, in terms of how the basic story worked, and whether or not it was a kind of Hidden Fortress-like adventure of taking the princess across hostile territory, which is what Hidden Fortress is all about, or more complicated than that, and one that involved several different kinds of worlds. And in the end, it seemed to settle down to a very straightforward, almost Western-like adventure with a coming-of-age story and very archetypal characters, and it seemed to gestate into that through all of the various drafts.
My original inspiration on this film was really to use mythological motifs to create a whole new kind of myth that was very updated and contemporary. So I used the Saturday matinee serial as my vessel to put this barrel of mythological motifs together.
When my new apprentice, Darth Vader, arrives, he will take care of you.
But what has become of my friends from the Earth? Do not worry. They are being cared for.
Yeah, I think this would be a fun little piece. You know, fall back to the rock people in Flash Gordon when they come out of the rocks. It's a little homage to that idea.
I don't think your boys can help. I must go alone.
You would only do great harm. I alone can save her.
I heard through the grapevine there was a famous Captain Cody in the 50s. I think it was a television series. And he had the kind of rocket pack and everything. So I heard through the grapevine. So I think that's where George may have got the name from, you know, the Captain or Commander Cody.
This is a piece that's a little bit of a tip to The Godfather. This is where, in The Godfather, he's doing the christening of the baby, and at the same time killing all of his enemies. And that's kind of what's going on here, is the emperor is declaring the empire. At the same time, he's wiping out the last of his allies, really. It's contrasting those two events against each other, which always works. It's nice to be able to have one guy doing something rather benign and the other one being very physical and active, in terms of the real horror of this situation, the real awful part of the situation is him declaring the empire, as contrasted to Anakin, who's actually wiping everybody out, cutting people in half and doing really terrible things. But it's not nearly as terrible as what the Emperor's doing, and he's just doing it with words.
When Lucas is quoting these found elements, he's using them as raw components to combine into a work of his own, exactly the same way that Arthur Lipsett used found footage to assemble 2187. Bob Dylan is, I think, unquestionably the most innovative and influential artist in the history of recorded music. And for all his endless originality, he's also, and he has been since his first album, a mashup artist. As famous as he is as a songwriter, his first record was all covers except for 2 songs, one of which was an ode to another musician, Woody Guthrie. Even after he started writing originals, though, many of his songs were based on reworked or outright appropriated traditional melodies.
Oh, it ain't no use to sit and sigh now, darling, and it ain't no use to sit and cry now.
Well, it ain't no use to sit and wonder why, baby, even you don't know by now.
In the folk songwriting tradition, this is an accepted and understood practice. This was always part of his career, but it seems like people started to notice it a lot more after his album Love and Theft. He put the title of the album Love and Theft in quotation marks because it was in and of itself an appropriation of the title of a book, and that book was in and of itself about cultural appropriation in blackface.
The eyes that look so mild, hurroo, hurroo.
He's like a sponge in a way, like pick up people's mannerisms, accents.
Your eyes that shone so mild when you first my heart beguiled.
Since the title was such a nod, people started digging, and once they did, they noticed that many of the lyrics were rewritten or copied directly from everything from Virgil to a memoir of a Yakuza. And there are hundreds of things. But really, Love and Theft is just when people started paying more attention. In the 80s, author Michael Gray found that a number of Dylan's lyrics at the time were actually quoted or reworked lines from film noir.
I'll have some rotten nights after I've sent you over, but that'll pass. I don't mind a reasonable amount of trouble.
It turned out that Dylan had a particular fondness for Bogart, which shouldn't be surprising.
This whole aspect of the film, which is the mystery, is based really on a 1940s, film noir mystery, Maltese Falcon.
You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?
All the great mystery movies of the 30s and 40s is the influence here. I wanted to have that kind of quality of one of those great Raymond Chandler mysteries. You got to remember that this whole series of films is based on a 30s genre, on a serial. The acting style is very much from the 30s. Conceptually, it's using the influence and the inspiration of the 30s films as its basis.
Look, I ain't in this for your revolution, and I'm not in it for you, Princess. I expect to be well paid. I'm in it for the money.
I'd stick my neck out for nobody.
Plus 15 when we reach Alderman.
And bring the 15,000 francs in cash.
I love you very much, my dear.
Yes. Yes, I know. I love you.
I know.
Watch your mouth, kid.
He's looking at you, kid.
This is the end of the chase.
It's the end of the chase.
In Chronicles, Dylan's memoir, there's a very moving passage where he describes the voice of another of his musical heroes, Johnny Cash, and he says that 10,000 years of culture fell from him. This passage turned out to be lifted almost entirely from Jack London's short story, The Son of the Wolf. The reason for doing this isn't that Dylan didn't have any opinions of his own about Johnny Cash or that he couldn't articulate them. He wants you to recognize the passage and know where it's from. By using it, he's evoking the rest of London's story, which is about a frontiersman named Scruff Mackenzie, and he's comparing Cash to this character. London's larger body of work is frequently about the untamed wilderness, the frontier era of American history, about howling wolves and their primal connection to the earth. You learn a lot about Dylan's feelings on Cash by his choice to place Cash's voice in that context. London is also an interesting choice of source material because he faced several major accusations of plagiarism himself. London openly admitted that he took stories from newspapers or even stories other people had told him, but the point was that when he had remade it into his final piece, he had transformed it into a new creation of his own. Dylan often chooses to quote from artists who themselves quoted from others because it makes it clear that what he's doing is not simply copying work from Jack London or any one other source, but rather he's putting his thoughts in the context of similar thoughts by other artists in a long tradition. Dylan's scholar Richard Thomas points out that it goes back even further. That's something that poets have been doing forever. It's a way of alluding to or correcting or parodying what came before. You hear the stolen line, but it's replaced by its new context. That's how folk music works, how the blues works. Virgil himself was accused of stealing from Homer, and the voice of Bob Dylan is like that. Layering of his work with intertext from Virgil enriches and universally changes the context of those lines, so that where we first heard a line from Virgil, with Dylan's intertextual usage of the line in a new context, it becomes something new. The start of the process is to discover that the theft has happened, but what's really important is the next step, to think about what effect the intertext in the song has on you as a listener. In other words, Thomas says, if you're dumb enough to believe this is like a student plagiarizing a paper in school, that's your own problem. When Dylan opens Like a Rolling Stone with the phrase, "Once upon a time," people understand that he's not claiming to be the first person to put those four words together in that sequence, and the song would lose some meaning if he was. People think it's theft when they don't recognize the reference at first, because they think it was meant to be hidden, but that's relative to their level of knowledge, not to the ethics of what Dylan was doing. If it was theft, it would be easy to slightly change the words to obscure the inspiration. The purpose of quoting verbatim is to tip your hat to the source. If you read something like Ulysses or Lolita, they're absolutely full of these types of quotes and allusions. But when Dylan or Lucas do it, people think it's either stealing or they don't understand it. Maybe I'm being pretentious again, but I don't see a huge overlap between James Joyce fans and Star Wars fans.
Yeah, it's like I see a chick and I'm like,
She's kind of hot, but I doubt she's into Star Wars, so I'll keep going.
Yeah, I don't know if she'll get in the Princess Leia get up for it.
Yeah,
you gotta...
it's like no metal bikini, it's not worth it.
But whether people notice the quotes in Star Wars or not, that's still the way many of them operate.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one. Hopefully it'll work.
The critics of the Star Wars prequels love making fun of this quote from Lucas, and but what he's referring to is fundamental tools of quotation and reprise. These are basic components in every artist's toolkits. It's just not something that's so commonly discussed in the kind of blockbuster trash that your typical YouTube critic is usually acquainted with. When people make fun of Lucas for saying this, they're, laughing at him for not being as stupid as they are. At the time, some people took Lucas's opening of the movie with "A Long Time Ago" as a possible reference to Sergio Leone's calling his Western Once Upon a Time in the West. Tarantino, of course, recently quoted Leone's title even more directly, and Leone himself was quoting it. Tarantino frequently pays homage to Godard, and Lucas arguably references Godard's science fiction movie Alphaville in Star Wars, and definitely was inspired in THX by Alphaville with the way that both of these movies use real locations and very few manufactured props to portray a sci-fi futurist setting.
How did you end up out here in the Outer Rim?
Route. Vous venez des pays extérieurs, monsieur, non? Figurez-vous, princesse, que moi non plus, je ne vois pas du tout de quoi vous parlez.
It was frequently commented on that Godard was among the first generation of filmmakers heavily influenced by films himself, and while Lucas is referencing Alphaville, Alphaville is also referencing several other movies itself.
Et décrassé. Il est mort. Et Guy Leclerc.
Son sourire et ses petites dents pointues me rappelaient à un de ces vieux films de vampires qu'on projetait autrefois dans les musées du cinérama.
Au revoir, monsieur. Monsieur.
And then, Lucas took ideas from some of those older movies that Alphaville was quoting also. The point is that these appropriations and repetitions reverberate back and forth throughout not just cinema, but all forms of art. It's not just something that is a copy of something. It's a copy that's a copy of a copy. It's like how Dylan is copying Virgil and Virgil is copying Homer, and each new riff adds layers of context and commentary. As Thomas said about Dylan, noticing that Lucas is quoting things is the first step. Understanding how and why he's doing it and what he's saying with it is the actual question. A good example of what Lucas is doing is the shot from the celebration scene at the end of episode 1, which is from the film Fall of the Roman Empire. In this particular shot, Lucas not only has a similar scene and a similar composition and a similar camera move, he replicates many details of the arch and the surrounding buildings exactly. Look at the statue of the horses, the circular building next to the side. You could say that this was just something that the model builders came up with on their own by using the earlier film as reference. But if that was the case, then how would Lucas know to replicate the camera move and everything else about the shot? The idea has to come from him. He's quoting the Fall of the Roman Empire because everything in Phantom Menace works on two levels. There's the fun kids film that it seems to be on the surface, and then there's the dark parable about Palpatine's rise to power that's driving those events beneath the surface. While the characters think they're celebrating a victory, they're actually celebrating the fall of the Republic. This is Lucas's statement about how democracies turn into dictatorships.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
It's from internal corruption, not from outside invasion. In the celebration scene, even the cheerful upbeat music you're listening to is actually a major key version of the Emperor's theme from Return of the Jedi. The characters think they're fighting an external threat, but the real threat is right there in plain sight, disguised. In The Fall of the Roman Empire, the parade shot that Lucas is quoting is directly preceded by a shot of a fallen leader being burned in a pyre, exactly how the parade scene in Phantom Menace is preceded by the burning of Qui-Gon's body. The death of one character is an event that lets others fill a void, and in both movies that change is going to lead to the fall of democracy. When Lucas quotes this movie, he's comparing his story to an entire similar historical chain of events that's happening beneath the surface. And that's just one shot. The quotes are much more extensive in sequences like Anakin being placed inside his Darth Vader suit.
I wanted him to get a sense that he was like a Frankenstein monster that had been created when he came off the table, without making it too obvious, but at least give that sensation that the Emperor has created some kind of monster, and that Anakin has actually become a monster. Not only physically, but also in his soul.
Throughout this sequence, Lucas is carefully quoting a number of shots from both Frankenstein and The Bride of Frankenstein.
He's still alive.
It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
So you might think, sure, Birth of a Monster, it's a pretty obvious reference. But think about what Frankenstein is about thematically, not just that it's a monster movie.
We're about to unfold the story of Frankenstein, a man of science who sought to create a man after his own image, without reckoning upon God.
It's about a mad scientist who violates the boundaries between life and death and creates something unnatural when he brings a creature back from the dead.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
The monster's alive again, but not really, not how it's supposed to be.
But the fiend must be found!
He has become a very great threat.
Thematically, Lucas has been emphasizing again and again that in a very real way, when Anakin became Darth Vader, he died.
Your father was seduced by the dark side of the Force. He ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, the good man who was your father was destroyed.
This is where he makes the pact with the devil. This is the very Faustian pact of trying to do something that he shouldn't be doing. You know, he's gone over the line. The killing of Mace, he was trying to stop him from killing Palpatine, which in essence was the right thing to do. He didn't realize that Palpatine was going to kill him. So up to that point, he was trying to do the right thing. But now he realizes, by having Mace be dead, that he's crossed over the line, and that he sort of succumbs and says, yes, you know, I'll do anything you ask if you allow me to keep my wife alive.
And we like him a lot. Mm-hmm. And we are going to watch him turn to the devil.
We're going to watch him make a pact with the devil.
Do you actually take us down, in the biblical sense, into hell?
Yes.
The lava.
The lava at the end
is hell.
Yes, it ends in hell.
They both end up consigned to flame. But instead of letting Anakin stay dead, Palpatine changes the natural course of things, just like he did when he meddled with the midichlorians to create Anakin in the first place.
He could use the Force to influence the midichlorians to create life.
And just as Victor Frankenstein did when he created his monster.
He's just resting, waiting for a new life to come.
It's interesting, too, that in the sequence, Lucas chooses to intercut quotes from both Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, just as he's intercutting the death of Anakin and the birth of Vader with the death of the bride of Anakin and the birth of their twins. This is all about duality and stories reflecting one another. The characters in the sequence are all twins to each other in one way or another. They're the dark or light reflection of one another, or a person's romantic other half. In The Bride of Frankenstein, the monster is looking for a mate, but when she sees him, she sees only a monster and wants no part of him. He was trying to find love by cheating death, again, just as Anakin was trying to cheat death to save Padme. But in their attempts to cheat death, they created something that was the opposite of what love should be, which is about life. People seem to understand that 3PO is a reference to the film Metropolis, but that's also just the tip of the iceberg with the connections between Star Wars and that film. First, Metropolis is the story of an endless city that's so tall that you can never even see the ground or any vestige of nature. And it's also the story of the factory underneath that city, where the dehumanized workers oil the machines and stoke the fires that the upper classes and the higher levels never never see or think about, but which are the capitalist machinery that makes their life possible. The creation of the creature scene in the 1931 Frankenstein was itself full of quotes of the creation of the robot in Metropolis. And when it was released, Metropolis was in turn accused of ripping off the novel Frankenstein. In Metropolis, Rotwang is another mad scientist character trying to cheat death, and the robot he's creating, on which 3PO is based, is actually his attempt to recreate his lost love. To give the robot the final characteristics of a woman, he kidnaps a woman and steals her identity for the robots. Just as when Anakin was trying to cheat death and save Padme, he actually ended up causing her death by going down an unnatural path. By having Anakin create 3PO, Lucas is able to emphasize the similarities of his story to the story of the mad inventor Rotwang.
Wouldn't have lasted long anyways if I wasn't so good at building things.
I'm good at fixing things.
But you can't stop the change. Any more than you can stop the suns from setting.
Sometimes there are things no one can fix.
Anakin is being compared to both Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster since he seals his fate by his own poor decisions attempting to play God. The theme in all three of these films is how, in an attempt to be the master of life and death, the characters start off with good intentions, but eventually begin to lose their humanity. Rotwang has even lost his hand as part of his mad experiments, and he now wears a prosthetic one. Rotwang explains that he considers losing his hand to be a small price to pay for what he hopes to achieve with his experiment.
Think of it, the brain of a dead man, waiting to live again in a body I made. With my own hands. With my own hands.
With my own hands.
Of course, what he is hoping to gain is exactly what he loses. When he sees the woman who he thinks is his creation and he tries to hold her, she doesn't recognize him and she sees only a monster.
I don't know you anymore.
Even the Faustian symbolism of these mistakes being a deal with the devil is reflected, as over the chair where Rotwang is creating hell, there is a large pentagram visible. In the factory beneath the city where the dehumanized workers are turned into machines, the fiery furnace that threatens to consume them as more fuel is referred to as Moloch, which is another devil figure in mythology.
Palpatine represents the devil. He represents the pure evil, the Dark Lord of the Sith, who is purely out to get more power and his greed.
These are all examples of new meanings being created in Lucas's art with appropriated images which have new meanings when combined in new ways.
This is new. Hutch, hold the others.
Gold 5 to Red Leader. Lost Tyree, lost Hutch.
How many guns do you think there are, Trevor?
How many guns do you think, Gold 5? I say there's about 10 guns. Some in the field and some in the towers.
Say about 20 guns. Some on the surface, some on the towers.
Now, scenes like the space battle in A New Hope were literally made by Lucas recording movies with aerial dogfights off of his TV and then cutting these scenes together into his own movie. Again, exactly like clips that made 2187 out of found footage filmed by other people.
Come in, Red 2. Where the hell are you?
Red 2, standing by.
On your tail, Jamie.
Watch it, you've got one on your tail.
The clips I'm showing here are only a few examples, mostly from movies that we know Lucas was influenced by because he's mentioned them in interviews or elsewhere.
Commencing flag suppression run.
It's not just specific shots of the ships that he used either. The whole structure of the sequence, from the briefing room scene before the battle to the explosion of an enemy base at the end of the battle, is all a mashup of various war films. While individual moments are from other films, the combination of all the different sources Lucas chose and the way that he chose to put them together made something that was new. Well, something like the pod race sequence also has dozens of shots that are lifted from the movie Grand Prix, and Lucas was a cameraman on that movie. There are also a ton of specific moments taken from Ben-Hur, to the point that some reviewers of Phantom Menace called the pod race a Ben-Hur parody, which certain scenes, certain portions of it almost are. And then on top of that, it echoes any number of other classic racing scenes. The point is that the individual elements might be quotations, but the way he chooses to put them together is a unique piece of art made by Lucas that shows something that the other pieces don't on their own. top of quoting other filmmakers, Lucas frequently quotes himself. Several shots in the pod race are almost exactly from an early student film of his own, when he was interested in being a documentary cameraman. Like the other quotes that Lucas does, some of these self-referential moments are simple things, like how he likes to always put in the number 1138 in his movies. The little nods go back to the beginning. John Milner's Hot Rod in American Graffiti has the first nod to another Lucas movie, with the license plate having THX on it. The Naboo Starfighter, which is the first starfighter that Anakin pilots, has a similar yellow and chrome look.
When we designed the Naboo Starfighter, that was a very specific case, because I initially thought that the ships would be very angular, like the X-Wing, but in fact we went the other extreme, which was going sleek and modern. So I started referencing 50s-style automotive hood ornaments.
And Anakin's Hot Rod in Attack of the Clones, with its yellow paint job and open engine, are an even more direct nod to Milner's Hot Rod. And then Anakin's tricked-out Jedi Starfighter with yellow paint in Revenge of the Sith is a nod to his Hot Rod from Attack of the Clones. And of course, the Jedi Starfighter is meant to be a precursor to both Vader's TIE Fighter and Luke's X-Wing, showing that father and son are again two sides of the same thing and bringing the references full circle.
Lock air spoils in attack position. Set air spoils in attack position.
This car that Bail Organa drives here is based on a Tucker. I mean, if you were to look at it very carefully. It's another reference to one of my movies. I guess we should have put a THX license plate on it, but we forgot.
But then some of the reasons he has for nodding to his own work are much more complicated. In THX, the shots of factory workers building the robots, which are the tools of their own oppression, are meant as a commentary on consumer culture. When those shots are repurposed to show how the Army of Clones in Episode 2 is created, it invites comparisons between the themes of THX and the fact that the Clone Wars is also motivated by dehumanizing capitalism, and is ultimately about two sides of the same thing fighting with themselves for the benefit of a small few who are orchestrating all of it. But more than other films or Lucas's other work, the most important thing Star Wars is quoting is itself. Over the course of the 6 movies, Lucas develops a language of visual symbols that become very meaningful in the context of the previous appearances. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of carefully planned moments that echo previous moments in very specific ways. And ultimately, this is the entire language of Star Wars.
This is where the fun begins. How long before you can make the jump to light speed?
There's a lot of stuff that's repeated through these movies.
No. No, Anakin, no! No!
I mean, between this trilogy of 4, 5, and 6 and the first trilogy of 1, 2, and 3, one is of the father and the other is of the son.
You're the closest thing I have to a father.
I need your help, son.
But there's a lot of scenes that are similar where the fathers and sons confront the same issues. It's almost the same scene.
It's not fair. It's unfair. It just isn't fair. It's not fair.
Thematically, there's a lot of things. It's like music. There's certain themes that keep repeating themselves, certain situations that keep repeating themselves. And the only thing that's different is the performance of the character and how does he react to that.
I can feel your anger.
I can feel your anger.
The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. You know, I'll tell a story in one way, and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly.
Concentrate on the moment. Feel. Don't think.
Use the Force. Think.
But I want to go. It's what I've always dreamed of doing.
I'd much rather dream about Padme.
There's good in him. I know.
I know there is good in you.
Search your feeling. You know, don't you?
Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
Search your feelings, Father. Qui-Gon Jinn would never join you. I'll never join you!
You're fulfilling your destiny.
Your destiny lies along a different path from mine.
Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny.
Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny.
It is your destiny, Luke. It is your destiny. If that is your destiny,
It is your destiny.
you will meet your destiny.
Fulfill your destiny.
Say it's a musical idea. You have a lyrical refrain, and you keep playing it over and over again in different, using different instrumentation, different octaves. It changes every time you rehear it. It's the same note played differently. I've tried to use that right from the very beginning when I did Star Wars. I was doing that. It really came out from something I was trying to do in THX, my first film I ever did, which was, instead of 3 acts, there's almost like 3 different movies. But each movie is telling the same story in a different way. I became fascinated with that idea of, it's kind of visual jazz. It's like you go off on a riff on the same idea, and you just take the concept and you just interpret it differently visually. And there's a lot of that going on in these movies. I like the idea of cyclical motifs that keep occurring over and over and over again.
There's an enormous amount of poetry in the trilogy. And that all comes from George, because you have to set up a situation in which poetry can happen. There's image after image over the 3 movies that are poetically beautiful, that work as visual metaphors for a lot of different things in this galaxy, The feeling of satisfaction is great. The feeling of satisfaction with the Darth story is very great, I think. And people were satisfied. I was happy with the way that turned out.
A lot of the concepts in Star Wars are very hard to really go into in a simple way because they're far too complex in the end. I put him out there as a very superficial thing, and it's really, you'd have to really start pulling it apart and to spend a lot of time to get to the bottom of what's really going on, especially in terms of the thematic issues that are involved in most of this. But it's been built up through the whole thing, and you'll see in 4, 5, and 6, the other movies, there's remnants of this political situation that are also in those films. So it's a complete circle, and it runs throughout the whole thing, which gives you the sense of where things are going to go after, Episode 6, which is that the Senate will come back and it'll become a democracy again, because now we know what a democracy was when it started, which was really in Episode 1, even though it was not very effective because of the corruption and the petty fighting. There's a lot of similarities sometimes with what Anakin Skywalker would say and what Luke Skywalker says to keep the idea or the theme moving in terms of their story, how their stories progress. It's the same thing with Obi-Wan. There's a lot of reminiscent things going on between the 2 films, different harmonics, so to speak, but it's the same piece of music.
Now get out of here.
Let's get out of here.
And you're having delusions of grandeur.
Illusions of grandeur.
Everything is going as planned. Everything is proceeding as I have foreseen.
As you wish.
As you wish, my lord.
Red 2, standing by.
Red Leader, standing by.
Lock air spoils in attack position.
Lock S foils in attack positions.
If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Strike me down with all of your hatred, and your journey towards the dark side will be complete.
I love you.
I know. I love you.
I know. Somehow, I've always known.
Your thoughts betray you, Father.
Your thoughts betray you. Order! Order! We shall have order! And bring order to the galaxy.
Hello there.
Hello there.
My young apprentice.
My young apprentice.
Good call, my young Padawan.
Is Anakin all right?
Is she all right?
I'm all right.
Are you all right?
No, don't! It's a trap! It's a trap!
It's a trap!
Welcome, Lord Vader. We've been expecting you.
Welcome, young Skywalker. I have been expecting you.
It's gonna get us both killed.
You're gonna get us both killed.
We're on your tail, General Kenobi.
Watch it, you've got one on your tail.
I'm gonna go help them out. I'll be right there.
You're my only hope.
It's already him.
Why do I get the feeling you're going to be the death of me?
Obi-Wan's gonna kill me.
Don't center on your anxieties, Obi-Wan. Keep your concentration here and now where it belongs.
All his life as he looked away to the future, to the horizon, never his mind on where he was. What he was doing.
Personne n'a vécu dans le passé. Personne ne ne vivra dans le futur. Le présent est la forme de toute vie. C'est une possession qu'aucun mal ne peut lui arracher. Le temps est comme un cercle qui tournerait sans fin.
It's like this was also, there's a thematic issue going on here of sort of concentric circles of, they're kind of in heaven, only when they fight, they're in this forgery, this red hell in the middle of this little capsule, sort of a world within a world within a world, rings of worlds, which is very Eastern in nature. They go to where they think they're going to get sanctuary, and they ultimately find the devil there. There's actually a lot of things like that going on that if you were to peel the movies back, there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of motifs, and a lot of concentric circles going.
You and the Nabu form a symbiont circle. What happens to one of you will affect the other. You must understand this.
So it's a complete circle, and it runs throughout the whole thing.
The circle is now complete.
Now I am complete.
Once you start looking for these visual parallels, one of the most obvious things you'll probably start to notice is that the ending of Phantom Menace has a bunch of shots that closely resemble the endings of A New Hope and Return of the Jedi. But it becomes a whole other thing once you start to really go like shot by shot and compare the moments that are being quoted. I mean, look at these shots of Padme and Leia. Padme is looking at Anakin and Leia's looking at Luke. And you see that not only are they shot in the same way, but the color palette of their makeup and their clothes are the same. The background with the beige tones and the plant life is similar. You know, the similarities are being done down to this minute level of detail. And then you'll start to understand why when you look at something like these other two shots, the first with Obi-Wan holding Qui-Gon's body, and the second with Luke and Anakin. Again, they're not just similar moments, they're exact symmetrical reflections of one another. By clearly telling you that there's a connection between these two moments, Lucas invites you to compare them. And the first death is a murder by a Sith, and the second death is self-sacrifice. The first moment is what causes Obi-Wan to train Anakin, which is a chain reaction that leads to everything in the next movies, until eventually Anakin's eventual realization of self-sacrifice is what's finally able to reverse that chain, both in the story and how the positions of the characters in the two shots are mirroring each other, reversing each other. By repeating images like this, Lucas is able to take very broad symbols like fire or sunsets that already have meanings and associations for us, and then by doing variations on them, he's able to say very complicated things. On its own, a fireplace is just a fireplace, for example, but it starts to mean something else when it's repeated in the exact place in the frame between the scene where Anakin's mother dies and the scene where he confesses his love to Padme. It also becomes a symbol for passion, a symbol for anger, but also for love. And then it means still another thing when an explosion of lava replaces the fire in the frame when Anakin is choking Padme, and the two characters are in the exact same relative positions they were in when he said that he loved her. Building up the symbol like this adds another layer to the original trilogy when you notice several shots in which the fire in Yoda's hut is used in a similar way, and then the repeated establishing shots of Yoda's hut always with a fire in the window, and then the final shot after he's died. The final shot in the sequence is from Luke's point of view outside of the hut looking in, and Yoda's already died as the fire goes out, so there's nobody in there to put the fire out. Maybe Lucas's favorite symbol is his sunset shot, and he's opened or closed every one of his series so far with a similar shot. He uses it to represent the possibilities of the future, like when THX has escaped and is entering a new world, or the sun is setting on the last night before they split up and leave for their adult lives in American Graffiti, or of course the obvious symbolism of Luke looking out onto the twin sunset. But again, Lucas takes this pretty obvious symbolism and he makes something much more complicated out of it. People notice the twin sunset scene, but it's reprised and played with maybe a dozen times when the characters throughout the 6 movies are at important turning points. In Attack of the Clones, when they're at the Lars homestead, Lucas quotes almost all the key moments at the same location in A New Hope, but each time now he shows the setting from the opposite direction or the other side of the room. This pays off with the shot of Anakin looking off into the twin sunset in the exact same place where Luke will be when he does the same thing years later, only now the camera is facing Anakin, not looking out with Anakin towards the sunset.
The Sith rely on their passion for their strength. They think inwards, only about themselves.
The only reason you know it's a sunset that he's seeing is from the long, ominous shadows. Then the moment is quoted again in the scene in Revenge of the Sith where he's deciding to go protect Palpatine from the Jedi. But in these shots, Anakin isn't looking to the sun or to the future, like Luke does in the original shot, but instead he's looking to screen left, which the intercutting implies is toward Padme. He's caught in his past in shadows. The color symbolism in the movie operates in a similar way. It starts off very broad with the bad guy imposing and in a black cape, and the princess in white. But then Lucas develops a system that's much more complicated than just black is bad and white is good.
In Star Wars, the first trilogy, Princess Leia's costumes are very, very simplistic. They're designed to not call attention to themselves. The Empire has taken over, fashion has gone out the window, everybody wears gray or white in a world where evil sort of is in control of things. Color plays an extremely important part in all these films. You know, red signifying evil, the red blood, the red devil, the red as an accent color for the bad guys. The bad guys mostly exist in a black and white world. The good guys live in an organic world, which is either browns, light browns, tans, or greens, you know, with the blue sky and stuff, but mostly it's, you know, the good guys are green and brown, the bad guys are black and white, which has to do as much with anything. It really has to do with that feeling, a philosophical feeling of a world of absolutes, mechanical world where things are rigid and absolute, they're black and white, as opposed to the organic world where it's more natural and, you know, right, wrong, black, white. These kind of things don't exist, at least symbolically, in that world. Things are more natural.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Red is the accent color that he uses associated with evil, but like fire, it more represents passion. You'll see that a lot of Padme's outfits are not only red or black and white, but sometimes they specifically echo the Emperor's later wardrobe.
In this particular Enterprise, they even got the hero dressed in black, so it's all basically shades of black. It was specifically designed so when his hand is cut off and when that final confrontation with his son is, that there's a big red splotch of color, of red, right behind them. Just sort of goes symbolically into the blood of the father and the son, and the move toward hell. Possibly because this is where it is. This is where he is either going to go to hell or not. And he decides not to.
Well, you better have those units in the South Range repaired by midday or there'll be hell to pay.
Gonna see you in hell!
Blue is used broadly as an accent color associated with good and life.
And I wanted it to be a water planet because water is where life began, and in this case this is a place where these people create life in the form of clones.
But blue is also a cold color. The middle chapter of each trilogy is where the story pivots, and he uses these color choices to show that to us visually by giving Empire Strikes Back and Attack of the Clones very deliberate color schemes that pivot from blue to red over the course of the movies. But each time the things that are shown in those colors are given a variety of good and bad associations and moments that show the characters going back and forth between them. The use of these colors is deliberate enough that Lucas thought it was important to pay attention to tiny little details like the light in the furnace in the junk room in Cloud City, which was flashing blue and red in the original version, but he changed it to red and he added sparks to emphasize the fire symbolism in the special editions.
You know, because we were dealing here with this motif of hell in the middle of heaven, so to speak. So we wanted to make it kind of ethereal and lots of steam and smoke. So it creates a very almost abstract set and setting that is more steam than it is physical reality.
Almost every major lightsaber duel in Star Wars takes place over a large open pit, which, like the sunsets, represents future possibilities. In this case, the possibility of them literally and symbolically falling into the pit if they make the wrong choices.
This scene here is again stressing the fact that Luke is making a critical mistake in his life of going after to try to save his friends when he's not ready. There's a lot of being taught here about patience and about waiting for the right moment in time to do whatever you're going to do.
We should be patient.
Patience.
I say patience.
Patience.
Be patient, Luke.
The boy has no patience.
You will learn patience. Patience.
Patience, my friend.
In Cloud City, Luke chooses voluntarily and for selfless reasons to fall into the pit, so he's able to pass through and retain his identity. And that's just like what Obi-Wan did when he chose to die for selfless reasons. In many myths, it's part of the journey of the hero to pass through the underworld and return with some special knowledge.
I am your father.
Almost the only major lightsaber duels that don't take place over a pit are in Revenge of the Sith, and that's because Anakin has already started his journey down. They're already in the pit. The only other ones are Darth Vader and Obi-Wan on the Death Star, which is a reprise of their duel on Mustafar, and of course the Death Star is a circular death symbol itself, and the Death Star is the same pit that Palpatine is eventually cast down into. And then the other one is with Count Dooku, and that's in a cave, and of course we can work out what a cave represents in these movies.
The cave. Remember your failure at the cave.
There's no cave.
The color that Lucas chooses to use most sparingly throughout the series is purple, which is the combination of red and blue. It's traditionally a royal color, and Lucas seems to use it in association with his political characters, which is fitting because in the series political power isn't inherently good or bad, it's what they do with it that matters. In the start of the final duel between Palpatine and Yoda, they're in Palpatine's chambers at the Senate, which are colored a diffused purple, in contrast to the brightly red apartment and office that we've seen him in before. He starts the duel with a hint of purple in his robes, but as it goes on throughout the sequence, you can see the purple being drained out until he's fully the stark black and white emperor we know from the original trilogy.
You have to sort of tease these things out of George. He, now and again, when he's talking a little unguardedly, he said, yeah, there are just so many layers in this scene, and you think, well, yes, they are, and it's not just in terms of character and color of personality, but simple basic things like the color of the set. Chancellor's Palpatine's office, which is very grand indeed, very big. And in number 2, there's some red in that set, some rather wonderful red, but against a background very harsh, metallic, high-tech gray. And I know that that red will slowly seep out of Palpatine's sets altogether to become the Emperor's set, which was a really forbidding gray world, right? And I sort of know that way, that's the way it's going. But it's interesting that it should go by degrees, and I'm sure people want to look back to see what Senator Palpatine's office was, which was a bit more colorful and so on. But slowly the color is just sort of dripping out of the atmosphere, just as it's dripping out of this man. Although you'll notice in part 2 that my eyes get redder, but they've got a long way to go to get to yellow. I don't know what the color spectrum plan George has in mind, but that's where they're going to go eventually.
This is a scene where originally the Emperor was pretty dark, and I had to brighten him up so that he's almost like death. He's this kind of almost white figure, white-faced figure, rather than a more realistic version, which was very, very dark and, like he would normally look under the circumstances, but I wanted him to have that kind of spooky death figure look about him.
Over the 6 movies, Lucas builds up this language of visual symbols that's so dense that it can all reach a crescendo in the final duel of Revenge of the Sith, in which almost every single shot, line of dialogue, and color choice is a reference to something else in the movies.
I don't believe you.
I don't believe that.
I don't believe you. I don't believe what I'm hearing.
I don't believe it.
Together, we will destroy the Sith.
Together, you and I can rule the galaxy.
Together, we can rule the galaxy as father and son.
Together, can we turn him to the dark side of the Force.
And the Republic has become the very evil we've been fighting to destroy.
Till now you have become the very thing you swore to destroy.
Not another lecture.
Don't lecture me, Obi-Wan.
I shall do what I must, Obi-Wan.
I will do what I must.
I try, Master. You will try.
There is no try.
You underestimate my power!
I think you overestimate their chances.
But I warn you not to underestimate my power.
You underestimate the power of the dark side.
Good point of view, and
From my point of view, the Jedi are evil!
From a certain point of view.
I have failed you, Anakin. I have failed you.
That is why you fail.
It suddenly becomes very meaningful that the battle on Mustafar is the only battle in the series with two blue lightsabers fighting against each other, that green Yoda is fighting against an Emperor who is almost completely colorless, and the red of Mustafar and the circular nature of the Senate chambers that are being ripped apart all mean more and more things when you think about them compared to other scenes.
And to take it into this arena, to me, was just a stroke of brilliance. We rise up into the Senate, you know, to take it to a place where we could actually destroy the place of government. The fight actually tears apart democracy. It actually rips the pods out of the walls and crashes them and destroys everything that Padme and Bail Organa and the people on the side of good have set up.
The dialogue tells you certain things, but if you're paying attention, the visuals are talking about so many other things, and a sword fight is the least of it.
I'm a visual filmmaker as opposed to a literary filmmaker, so the movie rests on the visuals. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue.
Bob Dylan was a bastard in the second half.
I don't think the spirit of the Dylan songs is being portrayed in this, with this incredibly corny group behind him. I like his earlier records as on his freewheeling LPs, etc., but this I just can't stick.
I think he's prostituting himself.
Makes you sick listening to this rubbish now.
He's just doing what he wants to do, isn't he? You know, if you don't like it, surely cut out.
He just changed altogether. He's changed from what he was. He's not the same as what he was at first.
The most clueless people in the world have a long, proud tradition of trying to tell our greatest artists how they should make art.
I was like an outsider. Anyway, I'd come to town as an outsider, and I still, in a lot of ways, I was still more outside than I ever was, really. They were trying to make me an insider to some kind of trip they were on. I don't think so.
I've discovered that most critics themselves are cinematically illiterate. They don't really know much about movies. They don't know the history, they don't know the technology, they don't know anything. So for them to try to analyze it, they're lost.
The Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological phenomenon named for professors Mike Dunning and Jay Kruger, in which the less a person knows about a subject, the more they feel that they're an expert. If a person is so ignorant that they're unable to conceptualize what they don't know, they believe they know everything. I think this explains almost all of the internet criticism about the prequels. But so many people hate the prequels, you say. Surely they must have some valid points. Well, no. Not really, no. I mean, but let's look at the typical points of people who don't like the prequels. As an example, I'm gonna mostly use the painfully typical YouTube critic, Chris Stuckman.
And when young Boba Fett picks up Jango's head, I always just expected his head to just go like plop, like right out from the helmet. I mean, that's where his head is, right?
No. I mean, no, his head isn't there. I'm not sure why somebody would think that Jango Fett's head is glued to the inside of the helmet or something. Lucas actually provides a shot showing where the head went. The shadow should be sufficient for people who have actually watched the films and are curious about this. Of course, actually watching the film doesn't seem to be a prerequisite for making YouTube videos ranting about how you know more about Star Wars than George Lucas does. I mean, this is the first type of common criticism of the prequels. Things that are just factually inaccurate from people who aren't watching closely.
So why would you send Anakin on basically the most romantic mission ever, in which they have candlelight dinners?
And when I got to them, we went into aggressive negotiations. Thank you.
Aggressive negotiations, what's that?
Now, Jedis apparently are forbidden to love, as this idea was introduced in Attack of the Clones. Jedis can never bang. They can't, no love, that's bad. So how are they supposed to fucking procreate? Like, what does that mean? How do Jedis procreate if they can't love? They just look for people to breed with? That's so dumb. How do you create more of your kind?
I mean, does he think the Jedi are a separate species or something? Why does he think that Jedi need to have sex for there to be more Jedi? Has he never heard of the hundreds of Earth religions that have celibate monks? Does he think that a new priest is born when two priests have sex? I mean, what the fuck is he even talking about? Seriously.
But something about that scene always bothered me. He's got a child-sized helmet in the cockpit.
Okay, so Anakin is wearing an adult-sized helmet? I mean, I love this one because, like, forget whether this guy's ever seen a Star Wars movie before. Has this guy ever seen a child before? I mean, how small does he think that child heads are? Children's heads are larger in proportion to their bodies than adults' heads. I don't see how this is confusing. But also, if you watch the movie, I mean, you can see that the helmet is large on Anakin. It's bigger than it is on the adults in the planes. It goes farther down his head. I mean, what the fuck is this guy talking about?
Can you imagine how much better of a scene it would have been if he had to wear an adult-sized helmet and it didn't fit and he had to try to see out of it? It would have been fun. It would have made the scene more entertaining if he actually had to try to fit into an adult helmet. But no, he has the convenient child-sized helmet just there for some reason.
This is really amazing though, because with all the bitching that people did about the kid-targeted humor in the prequels, like, does he honestly think people would have just loved like some slapstick sequence of Anakin's helmet falling off? They would have just loved that, you know. All the people that couldn't handle Jar Jar or any silliness, you know, oh, we need like 5 minutes of Anakin's helmet falling off.
It's these various ideas that could have been in so many scenes to make them better that Lucas never thinks of.
I mean, Lucas came up with the idea of Star Wars, you know, but Chris Stuckman came up with the Anakin struggling with his helmet idea. So plainly we can see who the greater font of creativity is. You know, I don't understand why Lucas wasn't bringing these geniuses on as consultants, you know? They're so full of good ideas.
If you want to see a good conveyor belt scene, check out Minority Report. Oddly, they both have moments in which our hero gets his arm caught in something, and they both came out in 2002. And Steven Spielberg and George Lucas are friends. Connections?
So, no connection. What is the connection he's implying here? Is he implying that Lucas stole this idea? Is he implying that Lucas and Spielberg worked on the scene together? What is he trying to say about that? Who knows? He's not trying to say anything. He's just babbling with whatever pops into his head. You know, this is what passes for film analysis on the internet. I mean, he does, however, miss the significance of Anakin's arm getting caught right before it gets cut off, of them becoming trapped in a machine, of the foreshadowing of him becoming more machine than man. He misses the fire and hell imagery throughout the scene, which foreshadows Mustafar and the lava. He misses the significance of Anakin's motivation in this scene, which is he's going down into hell to save Padme, who he's been separated from.
We wanted to get this feeling of Padme going off basically towards hell almost. It was really to get the red sense.
When this later happens on a grander scale, it's the same reason for his descent into Mustafar. Chris here misses that the factory is again reminiscent of the underworld in Metropolis that eats up workers to fuel the city above. He misses that Anakin getting swallowed by a machine and pulled along by a conveyor belt, or quotes from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, which again is about the dehumanizing effect of the factory age and capitalism on workers. He misses that these are both parallels to THX 1138, which is in itself a commentary on the dehumanizing effects in consumer culture. He misses that that was also quoted in this movie's Camino sequences with the clones, so this is, you know, important to the themes of the whole movie. It's drawing a parallel between how the clones are created like machines or like the droid army. Lucas is showing that these are both two sides of the same coin, which is a central theme of all of these movies about, you know, twins and the yin and the yang of things, and that Palpatine is playing both sides, and that war is an illusion to control the masses. I mean, in other words, he misses every single thing that's significant about the scene, and instead he just describes the surface visuals that he's looking at.
The idea of 3PO being disassembled and then trying to get himself put back together again is a motif that is carried through with Luke and also even with Han. It's a motif of the movies. In this case, it's physical. It's a physical manifestation, but in the rest of it, it's either emotional manifestation or a personality manifestation of somebody that sort of ripped themselves apart and is trying to put themselves back together again. So it's fun when you can take a literal character, in this case, you know, a Tin Woodsman or Humpty Dumpty, and break them all apart and then have part of the movie be about how he gets put back together again physically, which is what Luke is trying to do, what Han is doing in terms of his morality, but more importantly is what, in the end, what Darth Vader is trying to do.
You know, this is what passes for criticism on the internet. People look at this stuff and they think he's smart and that he's got better ideas about these movies than George Lucas.
During this fight between Obi-Wan and Grievous, though, impressive though it might be, there is a horrifically bad close-up of Obi-Wan where he's just like, oh, I don't think so, and it zooms in on his eyes and it's all like off-center, and I'm like, what? Where did that come from? It was...
Did he really ask where it came from, though? Because if he did, he would have found out that the shots were an homage to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Or, I mean, you know, really, if he knew anything about movies to begin with, he would have seen that, because it's a really, really famous scene to reference. I mean, this fucking guy hasn't ever seen a Sergio Leone movie.
Well, the other thing he could do is he could pull with his hand. He could sort of, you know, pull it open. You know, like
the gunfighter.
Yeah, like, you know, yeah, like Clint would do. Sergio Leone could do it with Henry Fonda. We can do it with Yoda.
And on top of that, this particular reference is actually a really interesting vein of stuff to look into, because the movies are full of references to classic westerns.
What makes a man to wonder? What makes a...
Looks like you two will have a lot to talk about. Come on, Lars.
Yeah, I sold them to a moisture farmer named Lars.
I'm all right. I'm all right.
Boba Fett is popular because he's mysterious and he's powerful, and he's very much like the man with no name from the Sergio Leone westerns.
Lucas especially loves Sergio Leone and doing an homage to classic gunslinger scenes and all the lightsaber duels. And then the same way that Lucas loves to quote Leone, Tarantino loves quoting Leone.
Not so fast. We only got a deal we trust each other. And a Mexican standoff ain't trust.
Whoa, you need guns on me for it to be a Mexican standoff.
You got guns on us. You decide to shoot, we're dead. Up top, they got grenades. They drop them down here, you're dead. That's a Mexican standoff, and that was not the deal.
Which is interesting because, like Godard, Leone also loved quoting movies himself. Once Upon a Time in the West is a movie that Lucas and Tarantino both love quoting, and Once Upon a Time in the West is, in and of itself, famous for being almost entirely composed of Western tropes and direct quotes from other Western movies. The scene of Han shooting Greedo under the table is commonly considered to be a quote of Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but the scene in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is often considered to be taken from Cheyenne Autumn, and so on and so on. The reason I keep mentioning this stuff is that it's much more complicated than just like Lucas is referencing a shot or a moment that he liked. The references are themselves references. It's part of a lineage of ideas, and with their repetition and variations, these things gather more and more context, and so you can say very complicated things by doing variations on them. It's a language, and it's a language that Chris Stuckman doesn't speak. I mean, to be fair, Chris doesn't speak a whole lot of English either.
I didn't expect it to be as ponderous as it is about the state of society. And Revenge of the Sith does feel largely resided over.
Jake, welcome.
I mean, but the thing is that Chris doesn't ask the why about anything. This is the whole problem. There's no analysis of why Lucas does things. There's analysis of whether or not he does what the lazy-ass YouTube critic would have done. If something seems strange to them, they don't try to figure out, well, why isn't it the way they would have done it? They assume that that means that it's a mistake, that Lucas fucked up. He didn't do what they wanted him to do.
So anyway, this assassin is after Padme, and rather than just fill her room with gas as she's sleeping, or shoot her or something, a little droid cuts holes into the glass and drops worms, like, into her room? Killer worms? Worst assassin ever! I mean, worms? What?
I mean, this is another example. The movie Lucas is probably most consciously referencing here is Dr. No, because the shots on the position of the bed and everything else in the scene is very similar to that scene in that movie where James Bond is nearly killed by a tarantula. But the idea of an assassin trying to use a deadly snake or an insect to kill the hero is an incredibly famous trope that's been used countless times. The James Bond movies alone use it at least 3 times. It's usually usually when the person is in the bathroom or in bed where they're most vulnerable, and they're usually going to be killed by either a snake or by a insect, a tarantula, or a scorpion. So Lucas kind of splits the difference. He makes a sort of a centipede thing that's sort of half snake and half insect. But this trope is so famous that in a movie like Murder by Death, which is a parody of mystery and detective movie tropes, they do it twice.
Should I turn off the steam, Pop?
Not steam. Someone just put deadly snake in room. Wake me when it come near bed.
So I'm assuming it's something that famous, you know, Chris Stuckman must obviously be familiar with, right? Since he's a film buff and everything. But you know, when people complain about stuff like this, they take me right back to the original reaction to the title of The Phantom Menace. You know, when that title came out, people didn't just say they didn't like the title. They were confused. They're like, what the hell? Lucas lost his mind. This is such a weird title, you know? This doesn't sound like a Star Wars movie. And, you know, the weird thing is not only is it an obvious homage to the type of Flash Gordon serials Lucas has said that Star Wars is based on, it's the most sounding serial name he could possibly have come up with. I mean, if you Google the Republic serials and other serials from the time Saturday matinee serials, there's a Phantom something every year, sometimes more than every year. And you know, I'm just talking about the serials. It was a popular title for feature films. There were Phantom characters in comics. All that pulp stuff from the 30s, 40s that Lucas is referencing, it was Phantom, Phantom, Phantom every 2 minutes. I mean, this Bela Lugosi serial not only has a Phantom title, and then the first chapter has the word Menace in the title. It's the Phantom Menace is the most Star Wars name that could possibly have ever Star Wars. And people didn't understand it. They thought that Lucas must have lost his mind when, you know, it's their own ignorance that's on display. But the thing is that if you saw this name and you thought, well, that's weird, I don't get it, why don't you look and find out? I wonder where that came from. And if you look for, you know, 2 fucking seconds, you'd find the 9 billion Phantom Menace references, the Phantom this and the Phantom that, in serials and comics and everything, you know? And it's obvious because, like I said before, they want you to get these references, you know? Like the reference with the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the eyes, it's such an obvious reference that even if you haven't seen those movies, a shot like Yoda pulling back his robe to get his lightsaber, you should immediately understand that there's a gunslinger flavor, that this is, you know, a duel, a showdown at the OK Corral. You don't have to know every single shot of every single movie, but you do have to have a baseline cultural literacy that, again, Chris Stuckman doesn't have.
And we get to see what this creature is, and it is a marvel of stop motion. However, today, certain shots don't hold up that well, at least compared to the special effects of the first 2 films. Usually whenever Luke is on screen and he's obviously looking at a blue screen of some kind, and it just doesn't hold up as well anymore, but the actual stop motion creature, any wide shot of that thing moving, it looks magnificent still. So I came to the pod race sequence and I watched it through adult eyes. Now these are eyes that analyze movies. I like to analyze the way shots are cut together, the way sound is looped through a scene. I like to look at the lighting. I like to look at the way the camera moves. And as I watched this scene, I became aware of something that I've never noticed before. In fact, I've never heard anyone mention ever. Nearly every single shot in the pod race is from the right-hand perspective of the pods, and I would say about 80% of the shots are panning from left to right. Pan from left to right. Left to right. Left to right. Left to right, left to right, left to right, left to right. Shut up! If you think I'm showing the same shot over and over again, I'm not. These are all different shots. For some reason, Lucas never thought to put the camera on the other side of the pods. So you don't get a well-rounded view of this race, and it becomes very stale because you're constantly seeing the same movement happen. Left to right. Left to right, over and over again. I can't believe I never noticed this. I mean, yeah, there are shots like from straight on or from straight behind or a first-person shot, but I think there are maybe 1 or 2 shots that are actually on the left-hand side. It's nuts! I never noticed this before. The entire scene feels stale to me now, and I'm sorry if I ruined it for anybody.
So, like, I watched this clip here several times to figure out if I was missing something, because he's apparently not aware of, like, some seriously basic filmmaking shit here. I mean, just to make a point, I took the following clips from the very first 2 videos I found when I searched for 180-degree rule.
The 180-degree rule refers to an imaginary straight line you draw between two subjects in a scene. Basically, you want to keep all of your camera setups on the same side of that line.
A good example of this is going to be a character leaving his house. If the character leaves and goes from right to left, when I cut to another street shot, subconsciously, if I'm showing right to left, you know that that character is going farther away from his house. But when I shift that and have him going from left to right, I can insinuate to my audience that my character is traveling back to his house.
I mean, this is like some of the most basic, fundamental stuff there is to know about editing and screen geography.
Now these are eyes that analyze movies.
And, you know, I mean, so first he's lying about the scene because most of the shots in the pod race are from other angles. They're in front of the pods, the back of the pods, under the pods. There's aerial shots, close-ups, almost every type of shot you could use. But when Lucas does show the pods from a side view, yeah, he usually sticks to the right side for like really, really obvious reasons. I'll use the chariot race in Ben-Hur as an example. The chariots are filmed primarily from the right side because that's the point of view of the main portion of the audience. Even though the track is a circle, when they go to the other side of the track, they're still filmed from the right side of the chariots because they need to keep moving in the same direction on screen, left to right, otherwise it would indicate that they've turned around, reverse direction. When the chariots are shown from the left, it's purposeful. It's either to show them from the point of view of another racer who's facing back toward the audience, or to be disorienting when the chariots have gone off track. In a movie where there's a chase scene that's not on a set course with the cars going in one direction, the camera point of view can jump back and forth to each side of the car, because that creates a sense of confusion. It's deliberate in that case also. It creates the impression that the cars are going back and forth in different directions. It creates a sense of chaos that is purposeful to those scenes in which obviously it wouldn't make any sense in a pod race or a chariot race. And you know, I could keep going point by point through every stupid thing that these people say in these videos, but it's all the same. And there's just thousands more hours of it by other people on YouTube just repeating this stuff. People who don't know shit about Star Wars ranting and ranting about Star Wars has become an entire cottage industry. If somebody is just a casual fan and they misunderstood something in the movies, you know, that's bound to happen. But why do people who have made no effort at all to understand these movies create videos purporting to educate the rest of the world on them?
Now these are eyes that analyze movies.
You know, what the fuck is that all about? And these videos have millions of views. And anyway, you know, in the end, all these like self-appointed critics are just repeating one another.
So it's almost impossible for me to review this movie without giving a humongous thank you and shout out to Red Letter Media, because their review for The Phantom Menace is quite possibly my favorite movie review of all time. They said everything that's to be said, plus a whole bunch of things no one else ever thought of.
And for all of these people, the Red Letter Media review of The Phantom Menace is like the Citizen Kane of YouTube videos.
They're a bunch of not very bright bitches who ought to mind their own goddamn business.
I mean, you know, it's a video with jokes about killing hookers. It's thrown in every few minutes because they expect their target audience doesn't have the attention span to talk about movies for an hour. And, you know, so of course Star Wars fans love them. You know, I don't want to say your average Star Wars fan is dumb exactly.
When Star Wars opened, it coined the phrase blockbuster, you know, because at the Man's Chinese Theater when it opened in '77, it was going around the block.
But they aren't exactly film historians either. These people who think they need to teach George Lucas how to make movies have this remarkably shallow, incestuous frame of reference, primarily composed of big-budget adventure movies from the last 30 years. And then they just sort of, you know, parrot each other ad nauseum.
You know, it really adds a lot of tension in the movie when the main enemy forces are totally ineffective.
Lifeless, dull battle droids that can be cut in half in an instant provided absolutely no tension.
If you ask me, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi should have been combined to form a new character called Obi-Wan Kenobi.
And in all honesty, Qui-Gon Jinn shouldn't have even been in this movie. It should have just been Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Wait, why is there a child-sized helmet and goggles in the cockpit?
But something about that scene always bothered me. He's got a child-sized helmet in the cockpit.
But we never see the Jedis run fast again. Maybe there never really was a need to run fast again. Oh, yeah, that would have been a good time.
And Obi-Wan should have totally used his speed run to go through the red blaster door area, but of course he didn't.
It's on automatic pilot!
So then George Lucas completely and utterly finally ruined Star Wars forever by having Qui-Gon explain that the Force is microscopic organisms.
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
This entire idea and why this is in the movie is so baffling to me that I cannot even wrap my mind around it. It was never even explored or mentioned in the following 2 films.
Darth Plagueis was a dark lord of the Sith, so powerful and so wise, he could use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life.
And just when you thought that the Star Wars saga couldn't get any more confusing, George Lucas decided to introduce midichlorians into the mix. That's right. Apparently everyone just has little microscopic organisms floating around the inside of their bodies, and whoever listens to them correctly can understand the Force. It's not a mystical thing that binds us together with everyone in the galaxy, it's just these little organisms that live inside our body.
I want you to tell me who the main character of The Phantom Menace was.
But as you watch the movie, I challenge you to figure out who the main character of this movie is.
This movie is told primarily from the Jedi's point of view, but the story that's being told is essentially the story of Queen Amidala and her plight of having her planet blockaded, as in, say, Episode 4, where the story is told through the eyes of the droids, and this one is told through the eyes of the Jedi. From then on, I very purposely kept Anakin sort of on the sidelines. The Gungan and the boy are always kind of, outside in the hallway somewhere. But that is the way it would be. They wouldn't be included in these kinds of meetings. They're kind of puzzled by what's going on. They're standing on the sidelines. It's a little bit a riff on the very first film where the story is told through the point of view of the droids, who were sort of the lowliest characters. And this one, I'm doing it through primarily the 2 Jedi, but then the secondary characters are also carrying a lot of the weight when the Jedi aren't around, which is basically Jar Jar and Anakin. Because the central story is ultimately the Queen's dilemma. She is really ultimately the central character, and the story they're telling is really her story. When I originally wrote the screenplay for this episode, it was very much like it is now, which is that the story starts with Princess Leia and Darth Vader and sets up the premise of the movie, which is their stolen plans to a Death Star. But once we get past that little piece of exposition, we follow the 2 most insignificant characters, which are the droids. And this was an idea that I was enamored with that was used by Akira Kurosawa in the film Hidden Fortress, where you take the least important characters and you follow their story in amongst this gigantic intergalactic drama that's going on around them that they don't understand. And I really wanted to have the film be led by the droids. I was sort of amused by that. At the time, it was a very bold idea, again, to have the first half hour be mainly about robots. The only real human character in the first 20 minutes of the movie is Princess Leia.
The Red Letter Media reviews are really proud of this supposed revelation they had about the lack of a main character in Phantom Menace, and then all the second and third generation YouTube hacks like Chris Stuckman love repeating it verbatim. But it's a question with a really easy answer. This is the kind of criticism you get from somebody who has maybe read some shitty like How to Write Your Screenplay in 30 Days book.
If you like this, you can click right here and get Stuckmanized.
And they think that if they spot somebody not following that formula, that they found a flaw in the movie. And of course what Lucas is doing is much more interesting if you actually feel like thinking about it. And of course it also didn't start with Phantom Menace. In A New Hope, most people would probably say that the protagonist is Luke since he gets the hero's journey and all of that. But just like Anakin, he isn't introduced until around a half an hour into the movie. In A New Hope, the larger story is Leia, and we don't really see much of her outside of political situations until much later in the movie. And this is exactly what he did with Padme in Phantom Menace. Luke gets action scenes later in the movie, but he's oblivious to what's happening in the larger story with Vader and Obi-Wan and the Senate and all of that, just like how Anakin doesn't have much of a clue what's going on with Darth Maul or any of the rest of it. You might say Jar Jar's a sidekick, not a protagonist, but he's also the point of view character for the younger audience members who won't understand some of what's going on, just like how the droids in A New Hope were sidekicks, but a lot of the movie was told from their point of view. The stuff that Red Letter Media is complaining about with the multiple protagonists in Phantom Menace is stuff that's been there since the first Star Wars movie.
The ability to speak does not make you intelligent.
The difference is that they're not little kids anymore like they were when they saw the first movies.
I kind of stole one from a little kid, which was kind of cool, but it was Boba Fett, which I love Boba Fett, and like the kid had the last one, but his mom wasn't around, right? So I kind of like rolled up to the kid and I saw you had the last Boba Fett, and like the kid's probably, what's he gonna do with Boba Fett, really? I mean, so I was like, hey, you're not allowed allowed to take that out of this aisle unless, you know, your parents are with you. And he was like, oh, okay. So he put it down and he went to get his mom, and I snatched it up and ran to the cash register.
You know, and maybe you don't enjoy the prequels, maybe Lucas's tastes are different than yours, and that's a matter of personal taste. You can like whatever you want. But whether or not you enjoy them, the prequels that Lucas made are these astoundingly intricate pieces of work that reference everything from silent films to avant-garde cinema of the 60s. And so if you're like a Chris Stuckman or a Red Letter Media, and you think the reason you don't enjoy them is because you know more about movies than George Lucas does, I mean, trust me, that's not the reason. You don't. And you honestly, you should really stop saying that, because you're just making yourself sound like a dumbass.
It just shows that he doesn't know what's happening in the scene.
Yeah.
Or with the characters.
Or doesn't
it's amazing.
Or
doesn't care what's really happening in the scene. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When he's thinking about that specific bit, but not in the context of the overall movie. Like,
so what you're saying is George Lucas has a limited mental focus, a limited intelligence.
The thing is, I haven't seen my mother in 15 years. I don't remember what her favorite colors were, or what kind of flowers she would have even liked.
That's kind of depressing.
That old man is mad.
You said it, Chewie.
I remember when the Phantom Menace Red Letter Media review first came out and started becoming a thing.
is this for something, or what is this?
Yes.
I can't think of anything clever to say.
And people would excitedly tell me about this much-watched video they found, and they would be like, the review is an hour long. Like, the length of the review was in and of itself this amazing proof of the video's quality and deep scholarship.
Anyway, with these fucking Star Wars prequels, I'm always forced to go back to screenwriting 101. And a big four-letter word that comes to mind. Fuck. Nah, I'm just kidding. The word is crap. Nah, I'm just kidding. The word is shit. Nah, I'm just kidding. The word is piss. Nah, I'm just kidding. The word is poop. Nah, I'm just kidding. The word is garbage. Nah, I'm just kidding. The word is tone. And for those of you who don't understand what I'm saying, tone is how a movie feels.
You know, for one thing, I find it really sad that your average filmgoer seems to think that talking about a movie for an hour is an extraordinary amount of thought to put into a movie. I mean, these movies take hundreds of artists' years to create, and in the case of George Lucas and Star Wars, his Star Wars series took 3 decades of his life. You know, so why on earth wouldn't there be at least an hour's worth of things to discuss there? It's so weird. You know, I don't actually hate Red Letter Media as much as some people who defend the prequels do.
The kids at school are making fun of me because I'm so fat.
Yeah. When they're talking about something that they actually know something about, they can be kind of entertaining, you know? Mike is kind of endearing when he talks about Star Trek because he obviously has a passion for Star Trek.
I've been trying to lose weight. Nothing works.
And Jay seems to have watched more trashy horror films than most people can find time for in a lifetime. You know, he can tell you anything about that. But these people know about certain specialized subgenres of popular culture of the last 30 years or so.
Are you still talking about Star Wars?
Of course.
That's the information they're working with. They're not film critics. Their Star Wars reviews are just long rants filled with misinformation, no research, and they're targeted at an audience that needs jokes about killing hookers every few minutes to keep them awake. But you know, in spite of having zero insight, reviews like this are vastly popular.
And get Stuckmanized.
People just want to watch this shit to have the same things repeated to them over and over again, like how you rock a baby to sleep.
And get Stuckmanized. And get Stuckmanized. And get Stuckmanized. And get Stuckmanized.
And this is a fundamental problem with what people think the role of film criticism should be. They don't want to be challenged or made to think. They think a good review is one that just agrees with what they already thought or predicts what they will think. As much as I rag on him, Chris Stuckman seems like he's probably a pretty nice guy, I guess. And I think that's a key to his popularity. If you're a certain kind of, you know, basic bro, you look at this guy and think you could probably hang out with him. He just says everything you already think, and he likes everything you like. He hates the prequels you hate. So it just goes down easy, you know, and thus an internet celebrity is born. I watch and read reviews to learn things and hear opinions I might not have thought of on my own. I already know what my opinion is, so I don't need somebody with a funny voice making jokes about killing hookers and repeating it back to me.
Rape jokes. I love them.
If the reviewer is educated and can support their opinions well, I seek out reviews specifically that I disagree with. Either they'll change my opinion and broaden my horizons, or they'll make me articulate why I disagree with them and I'll understand my own opinion better.
Such an incredibly well-made movie, but I can totally understand how anyone would watch this and say, I mean, it's good, but like, why does everyone say this is the best movie ever made? It's kind of boring. Like, I can totally see people thinking that because it does not follow common story structure. It's not like a enthralling story, so to speak. And you really can't deny the importance and the impactfulness of this film. I'm gonna give Citizen Kane an A+.
Oh good, finally Orson Welles can rest in peace, you know? Because the legacy of Citizen Kane wouldn't have been secure without us knowing what Chris Stuckman thought of it. I mean, actually his review of Citizen Kane is a perfect example of what I'm talking about here, because in the whole thing he gives no sign that he has any knowledge at all about the history of the film, the technique, why it was groundbreaking, or...
Now these are eyes that analyze movies.
Like any idea at all of why it's so highly regarded. He just repeats again and again that it's well made. But, you know, he's careful to emphasize that he understands if you don't enjoy it because you think it's old-fashioned and boring. I don't know whether he actually doesn't know anything about the movie, but I think it's just as likely that he doesn't get into saying anything intelligent about it because he knows that would be a turnoff to his audience. If he actually showed any sort of passion for movies from the 1940s, they'd think like, oh, whoops, this guy's a pretentious asshole. I guess this channel isn't for me. Better go find somebody as stupid as I am. You know, sometimes the red letter media reviews are so close to making an actual insight that I wonder if they actually know that they're wrong, but they backed off saying something smart because that might have been a turnoff to their viewers.
First of all, forcing someone to sign a treaty sort of contradicts the purpose of a signature on a treaty.
Like, no shit, the treaty would be invalid if they forced her to sign it. The entire point of what Palpatine is doing in the entire movie is to get the Trade Federation to do something wrong so that the Senate will be upset about it so that they will have a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum, right? Like, does Mike think that Palpatine was worried about like a tax shelter on Naboo or something? If they weren't so busy doing hilarious bits dressing their friends up as hookers, like they might have got this. They were close. Palpatine wants the Trade Federation to do something that will get them in trouble and start a conflict. What would be the point of them doing a treaty that was legal and valid? To get there from what they're saying takes like one extra second of thinking that they just don't bother with. Like, I'm not really sure if they're too dumb to work out simple things like that, or if they're playing dumb for their audience, but whatever intelligent thoughts Chris Stuckman might have been withholding about Citizen Kane, I'm guessing that there weren't a lot of them. I mean, this guy is not an expert on filmmaking, regardless of how he might describe himself. Now, like, if you don't understand anything about movies, I'm not going to say that that's fine, because I don't think it's fine. I think that arts literacy is important, and it's a problem that it's something that's not taught in our culture. But I understand that not everybody is an expert on film history. What I don't understand is people giving these faux academic lectures to teach people about something when they themselves don't have a fucking clue about it. There's this video by Patrick Willems that's one of the most egregious examples that I've seen of this. He spends 20 minutes basically to say that the camera moves less in the Star Wars episodes that Lucas directed, and then he makes like a handful of superficial observations that are just factually incorrect.
The aerial battles are where the storytelling sticks the closest to that of the previous films. There are small additions like a crash zoom, and this is a minor thing, but it's also the first Star Wars movie to use a lightsaber as a light source.
But beyond that, all he has to say is that less camera movement is bad, and he seems to think that subjective point of view shots and like Spielbergian stuff like that is categorically better filmmaking. Of course, what it really isn't better or worse automatically, but much more noticeable so that somebody like Patrick can actually understand what's happening. I talked a lot earlier in this video about how Lucas shoots these movies like documentaries and the thought behind the different types of camera work, so I won't go into that again. But what's amazing here to me is that somebody can make a whole video about the visual language of Star Wars and not go into any of that themselves. In the beginning of the video, there's this segment where Patrick pretends that he's been holed up in this room researching Star Wars so much for this video, and that he's gone crazy and turned into a bearded hermit. And it's, you know, funny because the book he's holding is The Making of Star Wars by J.W. Rinzler, which is actually one of the best making of film books ever written. It's funny because if Patrick had actually bothered to read any of the book he's holding right there, he might have had some insight into how Lucas made these films. But then at the end of the video, you find out the actual reason for there to be a bit about him growing a beard is that he's doing a commercial for the Dollar Shave Club.
So you probably noticed that I was a bit of a mess at the start of that video. I was filthy, unkempt, and pretty stinky. And if you're wondering how I got cleaned up so fast, it's thanks to Dollar Shave Club, who were kind enough to sponsor this video.
So, you know, that's what these videos are actually about. They have nothing to do with learning anything or understanding anything. The thing is, if you want to learn about movies, everything I've pointed out so far about film montage and pure cinema and the techniques of visual communication George Lucas is using, you can find all that stuff for yourself online. You know, I remember being younger in pre-internet days, because I'm old, and I would read interviews with Lucas where he talked about his own student films and the films that inspired him, and I would wonder, like, what could those possibly be like? You know, they were these elusive, mysterious things. And now all this stuff is just here on the internet. A lot of it is free for you to watch anytime you want to, you know? If you're curious about 2187, you know, just go watch it. It's here on YouTube. It's free anytime you want. When I was a kid, something like that was just this mysterious thing that I would never be able to see unless maybe I went to film school someday and I found a class that was showing it, you know, and now it's right there for you to see. And people, even people making videos lecturing on Star Wars, just don't give a shit to find out. You know, instead of learning something, these videos are about reinforcing your own ignorance and making you feel good for the opinions that you already came into the video with. And, you know, the point is that you smash that like button and maybe buy some razors.
Yes! Oh my god. How do they make this more and more epic every time? How do they make this more and more epic every time?
This is why people talking about this stuff as though it's any kind of valid film criticism or analysis is so obnoxious to me.
Did you not say ever to yourself, well, maybe they had a point with this or with that?
The point is, it's like if you paint your house white and somebody comes along, well, that should be a greenhouse. Well, fine, but I wanted to paint it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with painting it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with me for painting it white. Maybe it should be a greenhouse. But I didn't want it to be a greenhouse. I wanted it to be a White House.
You know, the thing is, George Lucas isn't an idiot. He made The Phantom Menace a kid's movie on purpose, and he knew what the older fans would say, and he knew that some of them would be disappointed. At the time, he said that, you know, the fans are gonna hate it. It's like a Benji movie.
I don't think Daddy understands about us and Benji.
But believe it or not, he had reasons for wanting to do it that way. It was intentional to start out brighter and more innocent and then transition into a darker movie by Revenge of the Sith. That's the way Star Wars movies always have been.
You know, it's hard for people to realize, and I'm not supposed to say this, and I wasn't supposed to say it then, but, you know, it's a film for 12-year-olds.
Older fans like to say that this isn't true, and then they wax nostalgic about the olden days when Star Wars was darker and more mature.
In the not-so-distant future on a planet called Earth, it's Underoos.
Star Wars Boba Fett is here. That means Darth Vader's always near. C-3PO is lots of style. And R2-D2 just makes me smile. Star Wars Underoos are here, yeah! Something out of sight in underwear.
Oh, don't be so ridiculous, R2. Underoos are for Earthlings.
Yeah, remember those serious adult times for Star Wars? You know, what actually happened is that the fans got older but kept liking the same movies, so they want a movie that will make an adult feel like the original movies made them feel when they were a kid. They've built up a lifetime of preconceptions about what they want from the movies. When they were a child, they were more open to new experiences, and that's what made them appreciate the movies better. And I know that's probably something that would be seen as a contradiction with some of what I'm saying so far, because I have had people tell me, you know, how can you say these movies are for children, but then also go on about experimental cinema and Soviet film theory and all this being essential to understanding them correctly. But the thing is that those techniques are actually exactly why kids can love the movie so easily. One of the main reasons the Soviet government was so interested in film theory was that they saw in cinema potential for a universal language. It had the potential to be an excellent propaganda tool. With visual information and music, they could convey the messages they wanted to convey to the largest audience possible, regardless of what language that audience spoke. They were early to identifying cinema as its own language and to understanding the communication potential of it. When George Lucas talks about Star Wars being like a silent film, this is exactly what he's talking about.
But this is the kind of sequence where you can actually turn the sound off and pretty much follow the story and understand that the film is really working as an exercise in moving images more than it is, you know, the dialogue or the more traditional ways of telling a story. All the Star Wars films are really based on the theory and practice of silent movies, and they're designed to be silent movies. It's basically visual storytelling with a musical, emotional underpinning, and that's the way they work. A lot of the dialogue is really more lyrics to a song than actual dialogue that you'd normally see in a movie.
It's exactly because the dialogue is incidental and you can watch the films without understanding it that people react to Star Wars across cultures, across ages in such a primal way.
Watching these prequels again and knowing about the changes they've made to the originals, Lucas has always had a tough time conveying emotion through his characters without just having them say what they feel. He loves when people scream, "No!" or when Padme goes next, "Anakin, you're breaking my heart!" He has this thing where he's like, I need people to say what they're feeling. Because you can never actually convey emotion without saying it. I think that's what he struggles the most with in his writing. He's afraid that people are not going to understand what he's trying to convey unless they say it directly to the audience.
Like almost everything that Chris Stuckman says, the conclusion he comes to is exactly the opposite of what George Lucas is actually doing. The dialogue feels redundant to people because it's not intended to be necessary. The film is meant to work 100% without it. This is also the problem people run into with the acting. People are so conditioned to watch movies that are filmed plays that they expect the dialogue to tell you what the characters are thinking. But in Star Wars, the scenes are edited carefully so that everything you need to know about the characters is there in their facial expressions, their body language, and the other visual information about them with which you're presented. Take a scene where you think the acting is like overdone and watch it in a language you don't speak, and you'll see that everything you need to know about the characters is there in how they're moving, in their facial expressions. And for the amount of information you're being given this way, it's actually done really subtly and it's not overdone at all.
Je n'aime pas le sable. Il est grossier, agressif, irritant. Il s'insinue partout.
Even in a scene where you might think that the content of the dialogue is extremely important, you'll find that the emotional content of the scene is exactly the same without it.
Il n'a jamais dit ce qui est arrivé à ton père.
Oh, il m'en a dit assez. Il a dit que vous l'avez tué.
Non, je suis ton père.
Non, ce n'est pas vrai. C'est impossible.
I mean, the lack of self-introspection in some of these reviews that you find online is amazing, because reviews like Red Letter Media will somehow both complain that the original movies were darker, and then they'll also make fun of how Revenge of the Sith isn't for kids because it's too dark.
Hey, anyone still want to use the excuse that these movies are made for little children? I offer now is the time for you to bring that up. Lucas goes full-on adult audience here.
Star Wars, the original Star Wars, is a pretty gritty film. And,
Star Wars Underoos are here, yeah!
you know, just all the death and violence and murder and betrayal, and they blow up a whole planet of people.
They do.
And then everything else is sort of cartoony crap.
They make fun of Lucas for saying that the movies are for kids, but also including discussions of politics. Like this is some kind of contradiction. The thing is that all these complaints come from adults trying to extrapolate kid opinions that validate their own problems with the movies.
People sitting around going, yes, that's a good idea. Oh, I move for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum. Who gives a shit? Seriously, who cares? This movie was made for kids. You really think they're gonna sit down and watch that? A Senate meeting?
I've heard lots of adults saying the political discussions must be boring to kids, but I've never actually heard a kid say that they were bored by it. The longest scene in the Senate in the prequels, aside from the lightsaber fight between Yoda and Palpatine, is only a couple of minutes, and kids react to political talk the way they react to anything else that they don't completely understand. They gloss over it, just like they would if they were watching a movie in French, and exactly how I reacted to the scenes in A New Hope that I didn't understand when I was a kid.
The
rebellion will continue to gain a support in the Imperial Senate.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away.
That's impossible. How will the Emperor maintain control without the bureaucracy?
The regional governors now have direct control over their territories.
You know, I didn't know what any of that meant, and it didn't matter because the story was told to me visually. I could still tell who the bad guys were. You could tell when they were doing something that created a bad situation for the good guys. The political discussions weren't a barrier at all to children. They were just a barrier to adults who still had the taste of children. You know, kids love the prequels, and kids love Jar Jar even.
You excited for episode 1?
It was better than all of them.
What do you think, Cole? Worth the wait?
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I loved it. Aha! Mace Windu. Ha! Go, man, go! Ha! Oh, God. Clones!
So what did you think of the movie?
I loved it.
When I went to the Phantom Menace reissue in 2012, I sat in the theater in front of a 6-year-old that was patiently explaining the movie to his dad. I'm pretty sure his dad was already a Star Wars fan, but, you know, it was cute, so he let him. You know, when Darth Maul first appeared, the kid gasped, and then he whispered to his dad, he goes, "That's Darth Maul, he's bad." And then when they get to the Jedi Temple for the first time, the kid had this, like, reverential tone, and he goes, "That's Master Yoda."
Yoda.
And then when Jar Jar first showed up, the kid immediately started giggling, and he was like, "That's Jar Jar, Dad, he's funny." That's what the kid said about Jar Jar, and that's what kids think about Jar Jar.
Like that long-eared alien dude, I mean, he always messed up, but he ended up helping his army and stuff. I thought it was pretty good.
Jar Jar is an audience proxy character for children. You know, he covers up his eyes when something scary is happening. He's confused and overwhelmed by the big events around him, as the children in the audience would be. And I think in that function, which is his intended function, Jar Jar is undeniably, obviously a success.
I just don't understand that.
Toujours comme ça. On ne comprend jamais rien.
So you can watch the movies backwards and forwards and find new meanings in how the episodes reflect one another, but there is a correct order to view them in. In case you were confused about it, Lucas put numbers on them to tell you. It's not a mystery. Many things in the prequels were expressly designed to work best if they're watched as they're numbered, as the first episodes of the series. The whole first half hour of Phantom Menace, for example, is mostly devoted to showing you what a Jedi is and what they do, what powers they have, how a lightsaber works, etc., etc. And of course, if you were coming to this movie having already memorized the others, you didn't need to know any of that. I think a lot of the problems people have with the prequels come down to insisting on watching them as the second trilogy, instead of trying to understand that they were supposed to be the first. 3PO being made by Anakin seems like a big coincidence if you go backwards, but watching them in order, there's no coincidence. The two characters started out connected and they later diverged, rather than starting out far apart and then being arbitrarily brought together. Likewise, it might seem odd that out of all the Wookiees in the galaxy, Yoda happens to be friends with Chewbacca, but going the other way, not only does it make sense, it makes more sense than before. Out of the whole cantina, how does Obi-Wan manage to walk up to a qualified co-pilot with a suitable ship on his first try? It's because he knew Chewbacca. Chewie had helped the Jedi 20 years earlier. Not only is this not a mistake, it adds a layer and improves things in the original films. Another reason people have trouble viewing it this way is the idea that the originals will be spoiled if you see the prequels first. Mainly the idea of the "I am your father" revelation being ruined. As with all of these examples, this is people clinging to the way they originally saw the films and what they want the films to be, rather than trying to understand the films that George Lucas actually made. Because if you can make the effort to look at it that way, you would realize that actually it's a much greater surprise to go along in the whole prequel trilogy thinking that Anakin and Obi-Wan are the heroes, and then have Anakin turn and become a Sith. That's a far bigger and more consequential twist than "I am your father."
You know, you gotta remember this is one movie, and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear. When you see the films 1 through 6, it's a very different experience than seeing it 4 through 6 than 1 through 3. But the idea of when Darth Vader comes on in episode 4, it suddenly has a huge, powerful effect because you know right from the get-go that that is Princess Leia's father. You know that when you cut down to Luke, you know that that's his son. And you realize that Darth Vader is this pathetic character. He's not this big, all-powerful monster. He's actually a pathetic man who made some wrong choices, who found himself trapped in the world of evil. You know, he made a bargain with the devil, and now he's living in hell. And the only people that can get him out are his kids.
It also happens to make the moment in Empire Strikes Back better, because we've now seen Anakin turn and we know the movies can go there. So you wonder if it's actually possible that Luke will go there too. As a kid, I never really bought that Luke could turn to the dark side. I mean, he was the good guy, it wasn't going to happen. But viewed the other way, it already did happen, and it certainly could happen again.
The problem with one of these kind of movies is like Superman or anything else, but if you got a hero who can't be killed, then where's your drama? Well, here, what I've done is said, well, this guy can be killed. Don't worry, he's not the important one. There is another. It's a cheap trick, but it works.
I grew up with the original movies before I saw the prequels too, and so I understand that it's a difficult adjustment to make. But that's the way that Lucas made it, because he wanted the 6 films to work together as a piece, rather than just doing what would be more easily accessible to a certain group of fans who had grown up with the other 3 films first. And he was right, because he knew that eventually, if the films lasted and new generations kept watching them, that the first generation would be in the minority, and it didn't make any sense to compromise how the films worked for every other generation to please that first one. And you know, the thing is, it's always more rewarding to try to understand the piece of art that's in front of you, rather than only understanding your own predispositions. When the prequels were coming out, it was, a fascinating puzzle to me, and I was watching very closely how the structures of the 2 trilogies would tie together. Before Episode 2 came out, I predicted to my friends that it would end with a shot of Anakin and Padme's wedding. I said that 3PO and R2 would be there so that it could mirror the shot at the end of Empire, and also because Lucas always says this is all R2's story, so I thought that R2 should be the witness to the wedding. I predicted that Episode 3 would end with the shot of Luke being delivered to his family on Tatooine. I predicted that the first shot of Episode 2 would contain a camera tilt up to a planet rather than a tilt down. The reason being that every other episode starts with a tilt down, and once Lucas has a rule like that, there's usually one exception as a counterpoint. You can also see that it creates a symmetry with the last shot of Empire Strikes Back, which is the only episode that doesn't end with a group shot of characters. It ends with a shot of a ship. So that while that shot used to be the odd one out, now there are balancing counterpoints at the beginning and the end of the middle episodes of each trilogy.
La mort et la vie sont à l'intérieur d'un même sein. Vous avez peur de la mort? Évidemment non. Pourquoi?
You go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized, and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. It's not much fun, and you can't experiment. You can't do anything. You have to do it a certain way. I don't like that. I never did. I started out in experimental films, and I want to go back to experimental films. But of course, nobody wants to see experimental films.
Cinema is an art form with unique possibilities, and I think it's also probably unique in how many possibilities it has that have never been explored. As much as I love movies, I've worked in comics and prose because there's this huge barrier with movies, which is that they're just so expensive. You can make inexpensive movies now, but the visual possibilities of the art form suggest so many possibilities that can't be done cheaply. Saying that anybody can make a movie is like saying that anybody can write a novel, except that you're not allowed to use 1/3 of the keys on your keyboard unless you find financiers who will put up $100 million. The financiers are just there to make money though, and if interesting experimental movies could make money, they would make those. So the blame really has to go to the audience who demands to see the same thing over and over. When I've seen something that tries to be different or interesting, like Tree of Life or Upstream Color, the audiences who don't like it don't just say that it wasn't to their taste, they get mad, they feel cheated, because when they pay for their ticket, they feel that they've entered into a contract to get a certain kind of 3-act entertainment that's something that they will immediately understand. Star Wars managed to break through this barrier because it's also so entertaining, and it taps into things with a very broad appeal, and it uses for its grammar things children can understand. But the audience for Star Wars still wants to pull the artist down into making the movie they want to see, just like the mass audience for any other movie. As indignant as his fans might have got, Lucas still managed to please a mass audience, and also to make this whole other movie that operated on a secondary level concerned with the type of abstract visual communication most audiences aren't interested in. Star Wars isn't the most abstract or experimental movie ever made, but it is the only time that a work with this budget and scale was true to the personal impulses of an artist who is primarily interested in the poetic potential of the medium, rather than just using film as a storytelling delivery system. Big hit movies used to have authors, and now they have corporations. If you're interested in the medium as a mode of expression, you should enjoy the anomaly of Star Wars for what it is, rather than complaining about what it isn't, because at this point, who knows when it'll happen again. With the Star Wars prequels, audiences got 3 vastly more complicated, personal, and esoteric movies than they expected, and it's really sad to me that so many of them just couldn't be bothered.
Savez-vous ce qui transforme la nuit en lumière? La poésie.
Ça va mourir.
Détends-toi, nous ne sommes pas encore en danger.
Pas encore? Des monstères de dehors, une fouette de dedans. Nous ça coule et sans énergie. C'est quand pour vous ça? Nous ça en danger.
Ah voilà, ça revient.
Hein? Le gros revient aussi.